Santa Claus lives, and in whatever spot of the universe he harnesses his reindeer and loads up his sleigh, one thing is certain: he never yet put anything into that sleigh for little Carl Krinken. Indeed, it may be noted as a fact that the Christmas of poor children has but little of his care. Now and then a cast-off frock or an extra mince pie slips into the load as it were accidentally. But in general, Santa Claus aims at higher game: gilt books and sugar plums and fur tippets and new hoods and crying babies and rocking horses and guns and drums and trumpets. And what have poor children to do with these? Not but that they might have something to do with them. It is a singular fact that poor children cut their teeth quite as early as the rich. Even that sweet tooth which is destined to be an unsatisfied tooth all the days of its life, unless its owner should perchance grow up to be a sugar refiner. It is also remarkable that though poor children can bear a great deal of cold, they can also enjoy being warm, whether by means of a new dress or a load of firing, and the glow of a bright blaze looks just as comfortable upon little cheeks that are generally blue as upon little cheeks that are generally red, while not even dirt will hinder the kindly heat of a fire of coals from rejoicing the little fingers that are held over it. I say all this is strange, for nobody knows much about it, and how can they? When a little girl once went down Broadway with her muff and her doll, the hand outside the muff told the hand within that he had no idea what a cold day it was, and the hand inside said that for his part he had never wished it to be warmer. But with all this, Santa Claus never troubled his head. He was too full of business, and wrapped up in buffalo skins besides, and though he sometimes thought of little Carl as a good-natured little fellow who talked as much about him as if Santa Claus had given him half the world, yet it ended with a thought, for his hands were indeed well occupied. It was no trifle to fill 500,000 of rich little stockings, and then how many poor children had none to fill? Or if one chanced to be found, it might have holes in it, and if the sugar plums should come rolling down upon such a floor. To be sure, the children would not mind that, but Santa Claus would. Nevertheless, little Carl always hung up his stocking, and generally had it filled, though not from any sleigh load of wonderful things, and he often amused himself on Christmas Eve with dreaming that he had made himself sick with eating candy, and that they had a pile of mince pies as high as the house. So altogether, what with dreams and realities, Carl enjoyed that time of the year very much, and thought it was a great pity Christmas did not come every day. He was always contented too with what he found in his stocking, while some of his little rich neighbours had theirs filled only to their heart's discontent, and fretted because they had got what they did not want, or for something that they had not got. It was a woeful thing if a top was painted the wrong colour, or if the mane of a rocking horse was too short, or if his bridle was of black leather instead of red. But when Carl once found in his stocking a little board nailed upon 4 reels for wheels, and with nothing better than a long piece of twine to draw it with, his little tongue ran as fast as the reels, and he had brought his mother a very small load of chips in less than 5 minutes, and a small cake of maple sugar which somehow once found its way to the same depending toe, was a treasure quite too great to be weighed, though it measured only 1.5 inches across, and though the maple tree had grown about 1 foot since it was made. "Wife," said John Krinken, "what shall we put into little Carl's stocking tonight?" "Truly," said his wife, "I do not know. Nevertheless, we must find something, though there be but little in the house." And the wind swept round and round the old hut, and every cupboard rattled and said in an empty sort of way, "There is not much here." John Krinken and his wife lived on the coast, where they could hear every winter storm rage and beat, and where the wild sea sometimes brought wood for them and laid it at their very door. It was a driftwood fire by which they sat now this Christmas Eve, the crooked knee of some ship and a bit of her keel, with nails and spikes held in their places by rust, and a piece of green board stuck under to light the hole. The andirons were 2 round stones, and the hearth was a flat one, and in front of the fire sat John Krinken on an old box making a fishing net, while a splinter chair upheld Mrs. Krinken and a half-mended red flannel shirt. An old chest between the two held patches and balls of twine, and the crooked knee, the keel, and the green board were their only candles. "We must find something," repeated John, and pausing with his netting needle half through the loop, he looked round towards one corner of the hut. A clean rosy little face and a very glossy set of thick curls rested there, in the very middle of the thin pillow and the hard bed, while the coverlet of blue check was tucked round and in, lest the driftwood fire should not do its duty at that distance. John Krinken and his wife refreshed themselves with a long look, and then returned to their work. "You've got the stocking, wife?" said John after a pause. "Aye," said his wife. "It is easy to find something to fill." "Fetch it out then, and let us see how much it will take to fill it." Mrs. Krinken arose, and going to one of the two little cupboards, she brought thence a large iron key, and then, having placed the patches and thread upon the floor, she opened the chest and rummaged out a long grey woolen stocking with a white toe and heel and various darns in red. Then she locked the chest again and sat down as before. "The same old thing," said John Krinken with a glance at the stocking. "Well," said his wife, "it's the only stocking in the house that is long enough." "I know one thing he shall have in it," said John, and he got up and went to the other cupboard and fetched from it a large piece of cork. "He shall have a boat that will float like one of Mother Carey's chickens," and he began to cut and shape with his large clasp knife, while the little heap of chips on the floor between his feet grew larger, and the cork grew more and more like a boat. His wife laid down her hand, which was in the sleeve of the red jacket, and watched him. "It will never do to put that in first," she said. "The masts would be broken. I think I'll fill the toe of the stocking with apples." "And where will you get apples?" said John Krinken, shaping the keel of his boat. "I've got them," said his wife, 3 rosy-cheeked apples. "Last Saturday as I came from market a man went by with a load of apples, and as I came on I found that he had dropped 3 out of his wagon. So I picked them up." "3 apples," said John. "Well, I'll give him a penny to fill up the chinks." "And I've got an old purse that he can keep it in," said the mother. "How long do you suppose he will keep it?" said John. "Well, he'll want to put it somewhere while he does keep it," said Mrs. Krinken. "The purse is old, but it was handsome once, and it will please the child anyway. And then there are his new shoes." So when the boat was done, Mrs. Krinken brought out the apples and slipped them into the stocking, and then the shoes went in, and the purse, and the penny, which of course ran all the way down to the biggest red darn of all, in the very toe of the stocking. But there was still abundance of room left. "If only one had some sugar things," said Mrs. Krinken. "Or some nuts," said John. "Or a book," rejoined his wife. "Carl takes to his book wonderfully." "Yes," said John. "All 3 would fill up in fine style." "Well, there is a book he can have, only I don't know what it is about nor whether he would like it. That poor lady we took from an American wreck when I was mate of the Skean Elf had it in her pocket, and she gave it to me when she died, because I didn't let her die in the water, poor soul. She said it was worth a great deal, and I think the clasp is silver." "Oh, I dare say he would like it," said Mrs. Krinken. "Give him that, and I'll put in the old pine cone. He's old enough to take care of it now. I think he will be content." The book, with its worn leather binding and tarnished silver clasp, was dusted and rubbed up and put in, and the old sharp-pointed pine cone followed, and the fisherman and his wife followed it up with a great deal of love and a blessing. And then the stocking was quite full. It was midnight, and the fire had long been covered up, and John Krinken and his wife were fast asleep, and little Carl was in the midst of the hard bed and his sweet dreams as before. The stocking hung by the side of the little fireplace, as still as if it had never walked about in its life, and not a sound could be heard but the beat of the surf upon the shore, and an occasional sigh from the wind, for the wind is always melancholy at Christmas. Once or twice an old rat peeped cautiously out of his hole, and seeing nobody, had crossed the floor and sat down in front of the stocking, which his sharp nose immediately pointed out to him. But though he could smell the apples plainly enough, he was afraid that long thing might hold a trap as well, and so he did nothing but smell and snuff and show his teeth. As for the little mice, they ran out and danced a measure on the hearth and then back again, after which one of them squealed for some time for the amusement of the rest. But just at midnight there was another noise heard, as somebody says, you could hear on the roof the scraping and prancing of each little hoof, and down came Santa Claus through the chimney. He must have set out very early that night to have so much time to spare, or perhaps he was cold in spite of his furs, for he came empty-handed and had evidently no business calls in that direction, but the first thing he did was to examine the stocking and its contents. At some of the articles he laughed, and at some he frowned. But most of all did he shake his head over the love that filled up all the spare room in the stocking. It was a kind of thing Santa Claus was not used to. The little stockings were generally too full for anything of that sort. When they had to hold candy enough to make the child sick, and toys enough to make him unhappy because he did not know which to play with first, of course very little love could get in. And there is no telling how many children would be satisfied if it did. But Santa Claus put all the things back just as he had found them, and stood smiling to himself for a minute, with his hands on his sides and his back to the fire. Then, tapping the stocking with a little stick that he carried, he bent down over Carl and whispered some words in his ear, and went off up the chimney. And the little mice came out and danced on the floor till the day broke. Christmas Day in the morning, and what a day it was! All night long as the hours went by, the waves had beaten time with their heavy feet, and wherever the foam and spray had fallen upon board or stone or crooked stick, there it had frozen, in long icicles or fringes or little white caps. But when the sun had climbed out of the leaden sea, every morsel of foam and ice sparkled and twinkled like morning stars, and the day got her cheeks warm and glowing as fast as she could. And the next thing the sun did was to walk in at the hut window and look at little Carl Krinken. Then it laid a warm hand upon his little face, and Carl had hardly smiled away the last bit of his dream before he started up in bed and shouted, "Merry Christmas!" The mice were much alarmed, for they had not all seen their partners safe home, but they got out of the way as fast as they could, and when Carl bounded out of bed he stood alone upon the floor. The floor felt cold, very. Carl's toes curled up in the most disapproving manner possible, and he tried standing on his heels. Then he scampered across the floor and began to feel at the stocking, beginning at the top. It was plain enough what the shoes were, but the other things puzzled him till he got to the foot of the stocking, and his feet being by that time very cold, for both toes and heels had rested on the floor in the eagerness of examination. Carl seized the stocking in both hands and scampered back to bed again, screaming out, "Apples, apples, apples!" His mother being now awakened by his clambering over her for the second time, she gave him a kiss and a Merry Christmas and got up, and as his father did the same, Carl was left in undisturbed possession of the warm bed. There he laid himself down as snug as could be with the long stocking by his side, and began to pull out and examine the things one by one, after which each article was laid on the counterpane outside. "Well, my boy, how do you like your things?" said Mrs. Krinken, coming up to the bed just when Carl and the empty stocking lay side by side. "First rate," said Carl. "Mother, I dreamed last night that all my presents told me stories. Wasn't it funny?" "Yes, I suppose so," said his mother as she walked away to turn the fish that was broiling. Carl lay still and looked at the stocking. "Where did you come from, old stocking?" said he. "From England," said the stocking very softly. Carl started up in bed and looked between the sheets and over the counterpane and behind the headboard. There was nothing to be seen. Then he shook the stocking as hard as he could, but something in it struck his other hand rather hard too. Carl laid it down and looked at it again, and then cautiously putting in his hand, he with some difficulty found his way to the very toe. There lay the penny, just where it had been all the time, upon the largest of the red darns. "A penny!" cried Carl. "Oh, I suppose it was you who was talking, wasn't it?" "No," said the penny, "but I can talk." "Do you know where you came from?" said Carl, staring at the penny with all his eyes. "Certainly," said the penny. "I dreamed that everything in my stocking told me a story." "So we will," said the penny. "Only to you, to nobody else." Carl shook his head very gravely, and having slipped the penny into the little old purse, he put everything into the stocking again and jumped out of bed, for the driftwood fire was blazing up to the very top of the little fireplace, and breakfast was almost ready upon the old chest. But as soon as breakfast was over, Carl carried the stocking to one corner of the hut where stood another old chest, and laying out all his treasures thereon, he knelt down before it. "Now begin," he said, "but you mustn't all talk at once. I think I will hear the apples first because I might want to eat them up. I don't care which begins." The Story of the Three Apples. "I assume to myself the task of relating our joint history," said the largest of the three apples, "because I am perhaps the fairest minded of us all. The judgment and experience of my younger sister Half-Ripe are as yet immature, and my little brother Nerly is unfortunately of a somewhat sour disposition, and therefore less likely to represent things in a pleasant light. My own name is Beechamwell." At this opening, the two smaller apples rolled over in an uncomfortable sort of way, but said nothing. "As for me," continued Beechamwell, "I have not only been favoured with a southern exposure, but I have also made the most of whatever good influences were within my reach, and have endeavoured to perfect myself in every quality that an apple should have. You perceive not only the fine rounding of my shape, but also the perfect and equal colour of my cheeks. My stem is smooth and erect, and my eye precisely in a line with it, and if I could be cut open this minute, I should be found true to my heart's core. I am also of a very tender disposition, being what is usually called thin-skinned, and a very slight thing would make a permanent and deep impression. My behaviour towards everyone has always been marked by the most perfect smoothness, and on intimate acquaintance I should be found remarkably sweet and pleasant." "You'd better not say any more about yourself at present, Beechamwell," said Carl, "because I might eat you up before you got through your story, and that would be bad. Let's hear about Half-Ripe and Nerly." "My sister Half-Ripe," said Beechamwell, "though with the same natural capabilities as myself, has failed to improve them. Instead of coming out into the warm and improving society of the sun and the wind, she has always preferred to meditate under the shade of a bunch of leaves, and though in part she could not help doing credit to her family, you will perceive that her time has been but half improved. It is only one of her cheeks that has the least proper colour, while the other displays the true pale green tint of secluded study, and even the seeds of influence and usefulness within her are but half matured, and mine will be found as dark as the chimney back," suggested Carl. "Well, they are not exactly that colour," replied Beechamwell, "being in fact more like mahogany." "Well, I never saw any of that," said Carl, "so you don't tell me much. Never mind, I shall know when I cut you up. Now be quick and tell about Nerly, and then give me all the history of your great-great-great-grandfather apple." "Nerly," said Beechamwell, "was a little cross-grained from the very bud. Before he had cast off the light pink dress which, as you know, we apples wear in our extreme youth, the dark spot might be seen. It is probable that some poisonous sting had pierced him in that tender period of his life, and the consequence is, as I have said, some hardness of heart and sourness of disposition. As you see, he is not softened under the sun's influence, though exposed to it all his life, and it is doubtful whether he ever attains a particle of the true Beechamwell colour. There are, however, good spots in Nerly, and even Half-Ripe can be sweet if you only get the right side of her." "I'll be sure to do that," said Carl, "for I'll go all round." "Come, go on." "Unfortunately," said Beechamwell, "I cannot give you the information you desire about my respected and venerable ancestors. The pedigree of apples is not always well preserved, and in general the most we can boast of is the family name. Nor is that often obtained except by engrafting upon a very different stock. For one generation back, however, we may claim to be true Beechamwells. From root to twig, the parent tree was the right stuff. The remarkable way in which this came about I am happily able to tell you. A number of years ago, one Thanksgiving Eve, Widow Penley was washing up the tea things, and her little boy Mark sat looking at her. "I wish we could keep Thanksgiving, Mother," said he. "Why, so we will," said his mother. "But how?" said Mark with a very brightened face. "What will you do, Mother?" "I'll make you some pies." "If I can get anything to make them of," said Mrs. Penley. "Ah, but you can't," said Mark, his countenance falling again. "There aren't even any potatoes in the house. You used to make potato pies, didn't you, Mother, when Father forgot to bring home the pumpkin?" "Yes," said Mrs. Penley, but as if she scarce heard him, for other Thanksgiving days were sweeping across the stage, where Memory's troupe was just then performing. "So, what will you do, Mother?" repeated little Mark, when he had watched her again for a few minutes. "Do?" said the widow, rousing herself. "Why, my dear, if we cannot make any pies, we will keep Thanksgiving without them." "I don't think one can keep Thanksgiving without anything," said Mark a little fretfully. "Oh, no," said his mother, "neither do I. But we will think about it, dear, and do the best we can. And now you may read to me while I mend this hole in your stocking. read the 103rd Psalm. So Mark got his little Bible and began to read. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgiveth all thine iniquities, who healeth all thy diseases, who redeemeth thy life from destruction, who crowneth thee with loving kindness and tender mercies. Don't you think, Mark, said his mother, that we could keep Thanksgiving for at least one day with only such blessings as these? Why, yes, said Mark, I suppose we could, Mother, though I wasn't thinking of that. No, of course not, said his mother, and that is the very reason why we so often long for earthly things. We are not thinking of the heavenly blessings God has showered upon us. But, Mother, said Mark, not quite satisfied, it goes on to say, Who satisfieth thy mouth with good things, so that thy youth is renewed like the eagles. And Mark looked up as if he thought his mother must be posed now, if she never was before. It did occur to Mrs. Penley as she glanced at the child that his cheeks were not very fat, nor his dress very thick, and that a greater plenty of pies and other relishable things might exert a happy influence upon his complexion. But she stifled her heart with that word. Your father knoweth that ye have need of such things. I am sure we have a great many good things, Mark, she answered cheerfully. Don't you remember that barrel of flour that came the other day, and the molasses and the pickles? We must have as much as is good for us, or God would give us more, for it says in another part of that psalm, Like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him. I wouldn't keep from you anything I thought good for you. But you are my mother, said Mark satisfactorily. Well, said the widow, the Bible says that a mother may forget her child, yet will not God forget his children. So you see, dear, that if we have not a great many things which some other people have, it is not because God has forgotten to care for us, but because we are better without them. I wonder why, said Mark. Why should they hurt us any more than other people? God knows, said his mother. It is so pleasant to have him choose and direct all for us. If I could have my way, I dare say I should wish for something that would do me harm, just as you wanted to eat blackberries last summer when you were sick. But we are not sick, said Mark. Yes, we are, sick with sin, and sin-sick people must not have all their sinful hearts' desire, and people who love earth too well must want some of the good things of this world, that they may think more of heaven. Well, said Mark, the last thing before he got into bed, we'll keep Thanksgiving, Mother, you and I, and we'll try to be as happy as we can without pies. Maybe we shall have some pleasant thing that we do not think of, said his mother, as she tucked the clothes down about him. Why, what? Said Mark, starting up in an instant. Where could anything come from, Mother? From God in the first place, she answered, and he can always find a way. Mother, said Mark, there's a great many apples in the road by Mr. Crab's orchard. Well, dear, said his mother, they don't belong to us. But they're in the road, said Mark, and Mr. Smith's pigs are there all day long eating them. We won't help the pigs, said his mother, smiling. They don't know any better, but we do. I have cause enough for Thanksgiving, Marky, in a dear little boy who always minds what I say. Mark hugged his mother very tight round the neck and then immediately went to sleep and dreamed that he was running uphill after a pumpkin. But Mark woke up in the morning empty-handed. There were plenty of sunbeams on the bed, and though it was so late in November, the birds sang outside the window as if they had a great many concerts to give before winter and must make haste. Mark turned over on his back to have both ears free, and then he could hear his mother and the broom stepping up and down the kitchen. And as she swept, she sang, Rejoice, the Lord is King, your Lord and King adore. Mortals give thanks and sing and triumph evermore. Lift up your hearts, lift up your voice, rejoice again, I say, rejoice. Rejoice in glorious hope, Jesus the Judge shall come, and take his servants up to their eternal home. We soon shall hear the archangel's voice, the trump of God shall sound, rejoice. Mark listened a while till he heard his mother stop sweeping and begin to step in and out of the pantry. She wasn't setting the table, he knew, for that was always his work, and he began to wonder what they were going to have for breakfast. Then somebody knocked at the door. "Here's a quart of milk, Miss Penley," said a voice. Mother guessed she wouldn't churn again for next week, so she could spare it as well as not. Mark waited to hear her mother pay her thanks and shut the door, and having meanwhile got into his trousers, he rushed out into the kitchen. "Is it a whole quart, Mother?" "A whole quart of new milk, Mark. Isn't that good?" "Delicious," said Mark. "I should like to drink it all up straight." I don't mean that I should really like to, Mother, only on some accounts, you know." "Well, now, what shall we do with it?" said his mother. "You shall dispose of it all." "If we had some eggs, we'd have a pudding," said Mark. "A plum pudding. You can't make it without eggs, can you, Mother?" "Not very well," said Mrs. Penley. "Nor without plums." "No, so that won't do," said Mark. "Seems to me we could have made more use of it if it had been apples." "Ah, you are a discontented little boy," said his mother, smiling. "Last night you would have been glad of anything. Now, I advise that you drink a tumblerful of milk for your breakfast." "A whole tumblerful," interrupted Mark. "Yes, and another for your tea, and then you will have 2 left for breakfast and tea tomorrow." "But then you won't have any of it," said Mark. "I don't want any." "Oh, but you must have it," said Mark. "Now, I'll tell you, Mother. I'll drink a tumblerful this morning, and you shall put some in your tea, and tonight I'll drink some more, and you'll have cream, real cream, and what's left I'll drink tomorrow." "Very well," said his mother. "But now you must run and get washed and dressed, for breakfast is almost ready. I've made you a little shortcake, and it's baking away at a great rate in the spider." "What's shortcake made of?" said Mark, stopping the door with his hand. "This is made of flour and water because I had nothing else." "Well, don't you set the table," said Mark, "because I'll be back directly, and then I can talk to you about the milk while I'm putting on your cup and my tumbler and the plates." It would be hard to tell how much Mark enjoyed his tumbler of milk, how slowly he drank it, how careful he was not to leave one drop in the tumbler, while his interest in the dish of milk in the closet was quite as deep. Jack did not go oftener to see how his bean grew than did Mark to see how his cream rose. Then he set out to go with his mother to church. The influence of the dish of milk was not quite so strong when he was out of the house. So many things spoke of other people's dinners that Mark half forgot his own breakfast. He thought he had never seen so many apple trees, nor so many geese and turkeys, nor so many pumpkins as in that one little walk to church. Again and again he looked up at his mother to ask her sympathy for a little boy who had no apples, nor geese, nor pumpkin pies. But something in the sweet quiet of her face made him think of the psalm he had read last night, and Mark was silent. But after a while his mother spoke. "There was once a man, Mark, who had 2 springs of water near his dwelling, and the furthest off was always full, but the near one sometimes ran dry. He could always fetch as much as he wanted from the further one, and the water was by far the sweetest. Moreover, he could, if he chose, draw out of the water of the upper spring in such abundance that the dryness of the lower should not be noticed." "Were they pretty springs?" said Mark. "The lower one was very pretty," replied his mother, "only the sunbeams sometimes made it too warm, and sometimes an evil-disposed person would step in and muddy it, or a cloudy sky made it look very dark. Also the flowers which grew by its side could not bear the frost, but when the sun shone just right, it was beautiful." "I don't wonder he was sorry to have it dry up then," said Mark. "No, it was very natural, though if one drank too much of the water it was apt to make him sick. But the other spring—" And the widow paused, while her cheek flushed and on her lips weeping and rejoicing were strangely mingled. There was a great rock, and from this the cold flowing waters came in a bright stream that you could hear rather than see. Yet was the cup always filled to the very brim if it was held there in patient trust, and no one ever knew that spring to fail. Yea, in the great droughts it was fullest, and the water was life-giving. But this man often preferred the lower spring, and would neglect the other when this was full, and if forced to seek the rock, he was often weary of waiting for his cup to fill, and so drew it away with but a few drops. And he never learned to love the upper spring as he ought, until one year, when the very grass by the lower spring was parched, and he fled for his life to the other. And then it happened, Mark, said his mother, looking down at him with her eyes full of tears, that when the water at last began slowly to come into the lower spring, Though it was very lovely and sweet and pleasant, it could never be loved best again. "Mother," said Mark, "I don't know exactly what you mean, but I do know a little too." "Why, my dear," said his mother, "I mean that when we lack anything this world can give, we must fetch the more from heaven." "You love heaven very much, don't you, Mother?" said Mark, looking up at her quite wonderingly. "More than you love me." Mark thought that was hardly possible, but he didn't like to contradict his mother, and besides, they were now at the church door and had to go right in and take their seats. Mark thought the clergyman chose the strangest text that could be for Thanksgiving Day. It was this: "There is nothing at all besides this manna before our eyes." When church was over and Mark and his mother were walking home again, they were overtaken by little Tom Crab. "Come," said little Tom, "let's go sit on the fence and eat apples. We shan't have dinner today till ever so late, because it takes so long to get it ready, and I'm so hungry. What are you going to have for dinner?" "I don't know," said Mark. "I know what we're going to have," said Tom, "only I can't remember everything. It makes me feel worse than ever to think of it. Come, let's go eat apples." "I haven't got any," said Mark. "Haven't got any?" said Tom, letting go of Mark's elbow and staring at him, for the idea of a boy without apples had never before occurred to any of Mr. Crab's family. "Oh, you mean you've eaten up all you had in your pocket?" "No," said Mark, "we haven't had any this year. Last year Mr. Smith gave us a basketful." "Well, come along and I'll give you some," said Tom. "I've got 6 and I guess 3'll do me till dinner." "Oh, Mark, you ought to see the goose roasting in our kitchen. I'll tell you what, I guess I may as well give you the whole 6, 'cause I can run home and get some more, and I might as well be home too, for they might have dinner earlier than they meant to." And filling Mark's pockets out of his own, Tom ran off. "It so happened," said Beechamwell, turning herself round with a tired air when she got to this point in her story, "it so happened that Mark, having stopped so long to talk with Tommy Crab, did not get home till his mother had her things off and the tablecloth on, and then being in a great hurry to help her, and a rather heedless little boy besides, there being moreover but one table in the room, Mark laid his 6 apples upon the sill of the window, which was open, for it was a soft autumn day, the birds giving another concert in the still air, and the sunshine lying warm and bright upon everything. The apples looked quite brilliant as they lay in the window, and as Mark ate his queer little Thanksgiving dinner of bread and a bit of corned beef, he looked at them from time to time with great pleasure. But when it was almost time for the apples to come on table as dessert, Mark suddenly cried out, "Mother, where are my 6 apples?" "Why, on the window-sill," said his mother. "There aren't but 5. There aren't but 5, said Mark. "I must have lost one coming home." "No, I didn't either." And running to the window, Mark looked out. There lay the 6th apple on the ground, appropriated as the Thanksgiving dinner of his mother's 2 chickens. Mark could hardly keep from crying. "It's too bad," he said, "when I hadn't but just 6, the ugly things." "You called them beauties this morning," said his mother. "But just see my apples," said Mark, "all dirty and pecked to pieces." "And just see my little boy," said his mother, "all red and angry." "Did you suppose, my dear, that if apples rolled off the window-sill they would certainly fall inside?" "I guess I'll never put anything there any more," said Mark, gathering up the 5 apples in his arms and letting them all fall again. But they fell inside this time and rolled over the floor. "You had better decide how many apples you will eat just now," said Mrs. Penley, "and then put the others away in the closet." "It's too bad," said Mark. "I hadn't but 6, and I thought you would have 3 and I'd have 3. "Well, you may have 5, said his mother, smiling. "The chickens have got my part, and maybe some good will come of that yet, if it only teaches you to be careful." Oddly enough, said Beechamwell, some good did come of it. When the chickens pecked the apple to pieces, the seeds fell out, and one seed crept under a clover leaf where the chickens could not find it. And when the snow had lain all winter upon the earth, and spring came, this little seed sprouted and grew, and sent down roots, and sent up leaves, and became an apple tree. "How soon?" said Carl. "Oh, in the course of years. By the time Mark was a big boy, and the tree blossomed and bore fruit, and from that time Mark and his mother never wanted for apples. He called it the Thanksgiving tree, but it was a true Beechamwell for all that." "But say, Mark isn't alive now, is he?" "No," said Beechamwell, twisting away from Carl and her stem together. "No, he is not alive now, but the tree is, and it belongs to Mark's grandson, and the other day he picked a whole wagon load of us and set off to market, and we three were so tired jolting about that we rolled out and lay by the wayside. That's where your mother found us." "Well, that is certainly a very pretty story," said Carl, "but nevertheless I'm glad my stocking was full. But I will let you, Beechamwell and Half-Ripe and Nurley, lie on the chest and hear the rest of the stories, for I like this one very much." Carl was tired sitting still by this time, so he went out and ran about on the beach till dinner, and after dinner he went up to his corner again. The sun came in through the little window, looking askance at Carl's treasures, and giving a strange old-fashioned air to purse and book and stocking. The shoes looked new yet, and shone in their blacking, and the apples had evidently but just quitted the tree, while the penny gleamed away in the fair light, and the old pine cone was brown as ever, and reflected not one ray. Carl handled one thing and another, and then his eye fell on his small portion of money. He might want to spend it. Therefore, if the penny could do anything, it must be done at once. And as he thought on the subject, the sun shone in brighter and brighter, and the penny looked redder and redder. Then the sunbeam fled away, and only a dark little piece of copper lay on the chest by the side of the new shoes. "Now, Penny," said Carl, "it is your turn. I'll hear you before the purse, so make haste." "Turn me over then," said the penny, "for I can't talk with my back to people." So Carl turned him over, and there he lay and stared at the ceiling. The Story of the Penny. "I cannot begin to relate my history," said the penny, "without expressing my astonishment at the small consideration in which I am had. I wouldn't give a penny for it. It isn't worth a penny." Such are the expressions which we continually hear, and yet truly a man might as well despise the particles of flour that make up his loaf of bread. People say it is pride in me. That may be and it may be not. But if it be, why shouldn't a penny have at least that kind of pride which we call self-respect? I was made to be a penny. I was wanted to be a penny. I was never expected to be anything else. Therefore why should I be mortified at being only a penny? I am all that I was intended to be, and a silver dollar can be no more. Pride indeed! Why, even Beechamwell here is proud, I dare say, and only because she is not a russeting, while I think... Well, never mind, but I have bought a good many apples in my day and ought to know something about them. Only a penny. People can't bargain so well without me, I can tell you. Just go into the market to buy a cabbage, or into the street to buy a newspaper and let me stay at home. See how you will fare then. Indeed, when there is a question of parting with me, I am precious enough in some people's eyes, but it hardly makes up for the abuse I get from other quarters. There is indeed one pretty large class of the community who always think me worth picking up, though they are over ready to part with me. To them alone would I unfold the secrets of my past life. I might have lain in a man's purse forever, and rubbed down all the finer parts of my nature against various hard-headed coins, but there is something in the solitude of a boy's pocket which touches all the sympathies of our nature, even beforehand. I am not, however, continued the penny, I am not at all of friend Beechamwell's temperament. In fact, I never had but one impression made on me in my life. To be sure, that was permanent, and such as time only can efface, though no doubt he will one day soften down my most prominent points and enable me to move through society with a calm and even exterior. For it happens, oddly enough, that while beneath the pressure of years the human face divine grows wrinkled and sometimes sharp, a penny grows smooth and polished, a little darker and thinner perhaps than formerly, but with as good business faculties as ever. When that time comes, said the penny, we refuse to tell our age. But until then we are perfectly communicative. I would at once tell you how old I am, but that you can see for yourself. I shall not give you a detailed account of my origin, nor of the fire and water through which I passed in order to become a penny. If when you grow up you are still curious about the matter, you may cross over to England, and there, down in Cornwall, you will find what may be called my birthplace, and can learn with full particulars why I left it. Neither shall I relate how I was pressed and clipped and weighed at the mint, nor speak of the first few times that I went to market and changed hands. My present history will begin with the pocket of a rich old gentleman, into which I found my way one afternoon, along with a large variety of the circulating medium. You do use such big words, said Carl. "Because I have travelled a great deal," said the penny. "It is the fashion." But to return to the pocket. What a pocket it was! At the bottom lay an overfed pocketbook bursting with bank bills new and old, while another of like dimensions held more value, snugly stowed away in notes and bonds. The leather purse in which I lay had one end for pennies and the other for gold and silver. But with my usual love of bright company, when the old gentleman slipped me in among a parcel of dingy pennies, I slipped out again and ran in among the half-eagles, for I was the only new penny the old gentleman had, and as by right I belonged about a half to him and a half to the bank. The cashier and he had some words as to which should carry me off. I believe the old gentleman chuckled over me half the way home. "If this part of my story teaches nothing else," said the penny, with a moralising air as he stared at the ceiling, "it will at least show the folly of going out of one's proper place. Had I been content to lodge with the pennies, I should but have been set to do a penny's work. As it was, I was made to do the work of an eagle, for which I was totally unfit. It fell out thus." The old gentleman walked leisurely home, having very much the air of a man with a pocket full of money, as I should think from the deliberate and comfortable way in which we were jogged about, and when he rang his own doorbell it was already quite dark. A dear little girl opened the door, dressed in a white frock and black apron. "Oh, Grandpa," she said, "I'm so glad you've come, because there's a little boy been waiting here ever so long for $10. "Well, my dear," said the old gentleman, $10 is worth waiting for. "But he's in a great hurry to get home before dark, because he says the children have got no bread for supper till he buys it," said the little girl. "He brought a pair of boots and shoes for you, Grandpa. His father's very poor, he says." "Is he?" said the old gentleman. "Then I'm afraid my boots won't be worth much. However, Nanny, my dear, you may take him the money for him since they're here." "Shall I fetch you a light, Grandpa?" said the child. "It's too dark to see." "No, no, not a bit of it. I know how $10 feels well enough. He shall have a gold piece, for the first time in his life, I'll warrant. It is too dark to read bank bills." And opening the most precious end of his purse, the old gentleman's unerring thumb and finger drew forth me, and laid me in the little girl's open palm. The soft little hand closed upon me, and down she ran to the lower entry. "There," she said, "here it is. Grandpa says he guesses that's the first gold piece you've ever had. Have you got a great many little brothers and sisters?" "This ain't gold," said the boy, too busy examining me to heed her last question. "He's made a mistake. This is only a penny." "Oh, well, I'll take it back to him then," said the little messenger. "I suppose he couldn't see in the dark." And away she ran. The old gentleman by this time was enjoying his slippers and the newspaper between a blazing fire and 2 long candles in tall silver candlesticks. "Grandpa," said the child, laying her hand on his knee, "do you know what you did in the dark? You gave that boy a penny instead of a gold piece. Wasn't it funny?" "Hey, what?" said the old gentleman, moving his paper far enough to one side to see the little speaker. "Gave him a penny instead of a gold piece? Nonsense." "But you did, Grandpa," urged the child. "See here, he gave it right back to me. It was so dark, you know, and he took it to the window to look, and he said directly it was only a penny." "Which he had kept in his hand for the purpose, I'll warrant," said the old man. "Took it to the window, did he?" "Yes, to slip it into his pocket. He needn't think to play off that game upon me." "But only look at it, Grandpa," said the child. "See, it's only a penny. I'm sure he didn't change it." "I don't want to look at it," he said, putting away her hand. "All stuff, my dear. It was as good an eagle as ever came out of the mint. Don't I know the feel of one? And didn't I take it out of the gold end of my purse, where I never put copper? Bad boy, no doubt. You mustn't go back to him. Here, William." "But he looked good, Grandpa," said the child, "and so sorry." "He'll look sorry now, I'll be bound," said the old man. "I say, William, take this penny back to that boy and tell him to be off with it, and not to show his face here again." The command was strictly obeyed, and my new owner, after a vain attempt to move the waiter, carried me into the street and sat down on the next doorstep. Never in my life have I felt so grieved at being only a penny as then. The boy turned me over and over, and looked at me and read my date with a bewildered air, as if he did not know what he was doing, and I, alas, who could have testified to his honesty, had no voice to speak. At length he seemed to comprehend his loss, for dropping me on the pavement he sank his head on his hands, and the hot tears fell fast down from his face upon mine. Then, in a sudden passion of grief and excitement, he caught me up and threw me from him as far as he could. And I, who had been too proud to associate with pennies, now fell to the very bottom of an inglorious heap of mud. As I lay there half smothered, I could hear the steps of the boy, who soon, repenting of his rashness, now sought me, inasmuch as I was better than nothing. But he sought in vain. He couldn't see me, and I couldn't see him, especially as there was but little lamplight to see by, and he presently walked away. "I am not good at reckoning time," said the penny, "but I should think I might have lain there about a week, the mud heap having in the meantime changed to one of dust, when a furious shower arose one afternoon, or I should say rather came down, and not only were dust and mud swept away, but the rain even washed my face for me, and left me almost as bright as ever, high and dry upon a clean paving stone. I felt so pleased and refreshed with being able to look about once more, that what next would become of me hardly cost a thought, and very wet and shiny I lay there, basking in the late sunshine." "I thought you said you were high and dry," said Carl. "That is a phrase which we use," replied the penny. "I was high and dry in one sense, quite lifted above the little streams of water that gurgled about among the paving stones, though the raindrops were not wiped off my face, and as I lay there I suddenly felt myself picked up by a most careful little finger and thumb, which had no desire to get wet or muddy. They belonged to a little girl about 10 years old. 'You pretty penny,' she said admiringly. 'How bright and nice you do look, and how funny it is that I should find you. I never found anything before. I wonder how you came here. I hope some poor child didn't lose you.' While she thus expressed her opinion, I was busy making up mine, and truly it was a pleasant one. Her calico frock was of an indescribable brown, formed by the fading together of all the bright colours that had once enlivened it. Water and soap and long wear had done this, but soap and water had also kept it clean, and a very little starch spread it out into some shape, and displayed the peculiar brown to the best advantage. Instead of an old straw hat with soiled ribbons, she had a neat little sunbonnet, and this was made of a piece of new pink calico, and made her face look quite rosy. I could not see her feet and pantalettes, for my back was towards them, but I have no doubt they were in nice order. She was too nice a child to have it otherwise. Her hair was brushed quite smooth, only when she stooped to pick me up one lock had fallen down from under the sunbonnet, and her face was as simple and good as it could be. With what contented eyes did she look at me! She didn't wish I was an eagle. Indeed, I thought it doubtful whether she had ever heard of such a thing. But I saw that her cheeks were thin, and that they might have been pale but for the pink sunbonnet. Whatever she meant by a poor child, little Nanny would surely have given the name to her. Suddenly she exclaimed, "Now I can get it! Oh, I'm so glad! Come, little penny, I must give you away, though I would like to keep you very much, for you're very pretty. But you are all the money I've got in the world." Now for the candy store, thought I, for as she turned and began to walk away as fast as she could, I peeped into the little basket that hung on her arm and saw there was a small loaf of bread. So I knew I was not to go for that commodity. She did not put me in the basket, but kept me fast in her hand as she tripped along, till we came to a large grocery. There she went in. "Please, sir, to let me have a penny's worth of tea," she said timidly. "Got 6pence to pay for it?" said one of the clerks, to make the other clerks laugh, in which he succeeded. "No, sir, I've got this," she said, modestly showing me, and giving me a kind glance at the same time. "It's only a penny, but it will get enough for mother, and she's sick and wanted some tea so much." The young men stopped laughing and looked at the child as if she had just come out of the museum, and one of them, taking down a canister, measured out 2 or 3 good pinches of tea into a brown paper and folded it up. The child took it with a very glad face, laying me down on the counter with a joyful "Thank you, sir," which I by no means repeated. I wanted to go home with her and see that tea made. But we pennies can never know the good that our purchases do in the world. The clerk took me up and balanced me upon his finger, as if he had half a mind to give the child back her money and pay the sum of 1 penny into the store out of his own private purse. But habit prevailed, and dropping me into the till, I heard him remark as he closed it, "I say, Bill, I shouldn't wonder now if that was a good child." I shouldn't have wondered either. We were a dull company in the till that night, for most of the money was old, and it is a well-known fact that worn-down coins are not communicative, and some of the pieces were rusty through long keeping, and one disconsolate little 6pence which sat alone in the furthest corner of the till was in a very sad state of mind, for he had just laid himself out to buy some rice for a poor family, and now could do nothing more for them. He was the last moneyed friend they had. In this inactive kind of life, some time passed away, and though some of us were occasionally taken to market, yet we never bought anything. But one evening a man came into the grocery and asked for starch, and we hoped for bright visitors. But I had no time to enjoy them, for I was sent to make change. The messenger was a manservant, and with the starch in his hand and me in his pocket, he soon left the store and went whistling along the street. Then he put his other hand into the pocket and jingled me against the rest of the change in a most unpleasant manner, picking me up and dropping me again just as if pennies had no feelings. I was glad when he reached home and ran down the area steps and into the kitchen. He gave the starch to the cook, and then marking down on a little bit of paper what he had bought and what he had spent, he carried it with the change into the parlour. But what was my surprise to find I was in the very same house whence I had gone forth as a golden eagle. The old gentleman was asleep in his chair now, and a pretty-looking lady sat by reading, while the little girl was playing with her doll on the rug. She jumped up and came to the table and began to count the change. 2 and 6pence, Mamma. See, here's a shilling and 2 sixpences and a 5pence and a penny. Mamma, may I have this penny? It isn't mine, Nanny. Your grandfather gave James the money. Well, but you can pay him again, said the child, and besides, he'd let me have it, I know. What will you do with it, Nanny? Don't you know, Mamma, you said you thought you would give me 1 penny a month to spend. To do what you liked with, said her mother. Yes, I remember. But what will you do with this one? Oh, I don't know, Mamma. I'll see if Grandpa will let me have it. Let you have what? Said the old gentleman, waking up. This penny, Grandpa. To be sure you may have it, of course. And 50 more. No, she must have but 1, said the lady with a smile. I am going to give her an allowance of 1 penny a month. Fiddle-dee-dee, said the old gentleman. What can she do with that, I should like to know? 1 penny? Absurd. Why, she can do just the 50th part of what she could do with $50, said the lady, and that will be money matters enough for such a little head. So you may take the penny, Nanny, and spend it as you like, only I shall want to be told about it afterwards. Nanny thanked her mother, and holding me fast in one hand, she sat down on the rug again by her doll. The old gentleman seemed very much amused. What will you do with it, Nanny? He said, bending down to her. Buy candy? Nanny smiled and shook her head. No, I guess not, Grandpa. I don't know. I'll see. Maybe I'll buy beads. At which the old gentleman leaned back in his chair and laughed very heartily. From that time, whenever little Nanny went to walk, I went too, and she really seemed to be quite fond of me, for though she often stopped before the candy stores or the toy shops, and once or twice went in to look at the beads, yet she always carried me home again. Mamma, I don't know how to spend my penny, she said one day. Are you tired of taking care of it, Nanny? No, Mamma, but I want to spend it. Why? Why, Mamma, I don't know. Money's meant to spend, isn't it? Yes, it is meant to spend, not to throw away. Oh, no, said Nanny. I wouldn't throw away my penny for anything. It's a very pretty penny. How many ways are there of throwing away money, said her mother. Oh, Mamma, a great many. I couldn't begin to count. You know, I might throw it out of the window, Mamma, or drop it in the street, or somebody might steal it. No, then it would only be lost. Or you might shut it up in your box and never spend it. Why, Mamma, said Nanny, opening her eyes very wide, would it be thrown away then? Certainly. You might just as well have none. It would do neither you nor anyone else any good. But I should have it to look at. But that is not what money was made for. Your penny would be much more really lost than if you threw it out the window, for then some poor child might pick it up. How surprised she would be, said Nanny with a very bright face. Mamma, I think I should like to spend my money so. I could stand behind the window curtain and watch. Her mother smiled. Why, Mamma, do you think there wouldn't any poor child come along? I should like to see that day, dear Nanny. But your penny might fall into the grass in the courtyard or into the mud, or a horse might tread it down among the paving stones, and then no one would be the better for it. But it's only 1 penny, Mamma, said Nanny. It don't matter so much after all. Come here, Nanny, said her mother, and the child came and stood at her side. The lady opened her purse and took out a little gold dollar. What is this made of? Said she. Why, of gold, Mamma. Think again. So Nanny thought and couldn't think. and laid her head against her mother and played with the little gold dollar. Then she laid it upon me to see how much smaller it was, and how much brighter. And then she cried out, "Oh, I know now, Mamma, it's made of 100 cents. Then, if every day you lose only a cent, in 1 year you would have lost more than $3.50. That might do a great deal of good in the world." "How funny that is," said Nanny. "Well, I'll try and not lose my cent, Mamma." "There is another reason for not losing it," said her mother. "In one sense it would make little difference whether or not I threw this little gold dollar into the fire. You see, there are plenty more in my purse. But, Nanny, they do not belong to me." And taking up a Bible, she read these words, "The silver and gold are the Lord's." "Do you think, Nanny, that it pleases him to have us waste or spend foolishly what he has given us to do good with?" "No, Mamma." "I won't get my beads then," said Nanny with a little sigh. "That would not be waste," said her mother, kissing her. "It is right to spend some of our money for harmless pleasure, and we will go and buy the beads this very afternoon." So after dinner they set forth. It was a very cold day, but Nanny and her mother were well wrapped up, so they did not feel it much. Nanny's fur tippet kept all the cold wind out of her neck, and her little muff kept one hand warm, while the other was given to her Mamma. When that got cold, Nanny changed about and put it in the muff and the other out. As for me, I was in the muff all the time, and I was just wondering to myself what kind of a person the bead woman would prove to be when I heard Nanny say, "Mamma, did you see that little girl in those brown steps? She had no tippet, Mamma, and not even a shawl, and her feet were all tucked up in her petticoat, and—" Nanny's voice faltered. "I think she was crying. I didn't look at her much, for it made me feel bad, but I thought so." "Yes, love," said her mother, "I saw her. How good God has been to me that it is not my little daughter who is sitting there." "Oh, Mamma." Nanny walked on in silence for about half a block. Then she spoke again. "Mamma, I'm afraid a great many poor children want things more than I want my beads." "I'm afraid they do, Nanny." "Mamma, will you please go back with me and let me give that little girl my penny? Wouldn't she be pleased, Mamma? Would she know how to spend it?" "Suppose you spend it for her, Nanny. People that are cold are often hungry too. Shall we go to the baker's and buy her something to eat?" "Oh, yes," said Nanny. "Will you buy it, Mamma, or shall I?" "You, darling." And when they reached the shop, Nanny looked round once more at her mother, and opening the shop door with a very pleased and excited little face, she marched up to the counter. "If you please, sir," she said, laying me down on the counter, "I want something for a very poor little girl." The baker was a large, fat man, in the whitest of shirt sleeves and aprons, and the blackest pantaloons and vest, over which hung down a heavy gold watch chain. He put his hands on his sides and looked at Nanny, and then at me, and then at Nanny again. "What do you want, my dear?" said he. Nanny looked round at her mother to reassure herself, and repeated her request. "I want something for a very poor little girl, if you please, sir. She's sitting out in the street all alone." And Nanny's lips were trembling at the remembrance. Her mother's eyes were full too. "What will you have, my dear?" said the baker. Nanny looked up at her mother. "What would you like if you were hungry?" replied her mother. "Oh, I should like some bread," said Nanny, "and I guess the little girl would too, but all those loaves are too big." "How would these do?" said the baker, taking some rolls out of a drawer. "Oh, they're just the thing," said Nanny, "and I like rolls so much. May I take one, sir? And is a cent enough to pay for it?" The baker gave a queer little shake of his head, and searching below the counter for a bit of wrapping paper, he laid the 2 largest rolls upon it. "A cent is enough to pay for 2, he said. "No, thank you, sir, you needn't tie it, if you'll only wrap them up a little." "Mamma," said Nanny, turning again to her mother, "I'm afraid that poor little girl don't know that the silver and gold are the Lord's, and she'll only think that I gave it to her." "You can tell her, Nanny, that everything we have comes from God," said her mother, and they left the shop. "What a nice little girl," said Carl. "I think I should like to marry that little girl when I grow up, if I was good enough." "The baker went right into the back room," continued the penny, "to tell the story to his wife, and I was left to my own reflections on the counter. But I had reason to be well satisfied, for it was certainly the largest penny's worth I had ever bought in my life. But while I lay there thinking about it, a boy came into the shop, and seeing me, he caught me up and ran out again. At least he was running out when he tripped and fell, and as I am noted for slipping through people's fingers, I slipped through his and rolled to the furthest corner of the shop. There I lay all night, and in the morning, when the baker's boy was sweeping the floor, he found me and put me in the till, for he was honest. But just then Mr. Krinken came in with a string of fish, and the careless creature gave me with some other change for a parcel of miserable flounders. That's the way I came here." "Why was he a careless boy?" said Carl. "I think he was very careful to find you at all." "Oh, because I didn't want to quit the baker, I suppose," said the penny. "And I don't like the smell of fish anyhow. It doesn't agree with me." "You won't smell much of it when I've kept you a while in my purse," said Carl. "I'll take good care of you, Penny, and I won't spend you till I want to." The next day Carl had tired himself out with a run on the sands. He used to tuck up his trousers as high as they would go and wade slowly in through the deepening water to pick up stones and shells and feel the little waves splash about his legs. Then when a bigger wave than usual came rolling in, black and high to break further up on the shore than the other great waves did, Carl would run for it, shouting and tramping through the water to see if he could not get to land before the breaker, which came rolling and curling so fast after him. Sometimes he did, and sometimes the billow would curl over and break just a little behind him, and a great sea of white foam would rush onto his shoulders and maybe half hide his own curly head. Then Carl laughed louder than ever. He didn't mind the wetting with salt water, and there was no danger, for the shore was very gently shelving, and the sand was white and hard, and even if a big wave caught him up off his feet and cradled him in toward the shore, which sometimes happened, it would just leave him there, and never think of taking him back again, which the waves on some beaches would certainly do. All this used to be in the summer weather. At Christmas it was rather too cold to play tag with the breakers in any fashion, but Carl liked their company and amused himself in front of them this sunny December day for a long time. He got tired at last and then sat himself flat down in the sand, out of reach of the water, to rest and think what he would do next. There he sat, his trousers still tucked up as far as they would go, his little bare legs stretched out towards the water, his curls crisped and wetted with a dash or two of the salt wave, and his little ruddy face sober and thoughtful, pleasantly resting and gravely thinking what should be the next play. Suddenly he jumped up, and the two little bare feet pattered over the sand and up on the bank till he reached the hut. "What ails the child?" exclaimed Mrs. Krinken. But Carl did not stop to tell what. He made for the cupboard and climbed up on a chair and lugged forth with some trouble from behind everything a clumsy wooden box. This box held his own treasures and nobody else's. A curious boxful it was. Carl soon picked out his Christmas purse and, without looking at another thing, shut the box, pushed it back, swung to the cupboard door, and getting down from his chair ran back, purse in hand, the way he came, the little bare feet pattering over the sand, till he reached the place where he had been sitting, and then down he sat again just as he was before, stretched out his legs towards the sea, and put his purse down in the sand between them. "Now, purse," said he, "I'll hear your story. Come, tell." The Story of the Two Shoes. "I believe," said the right shoe, "that I am the first individual of my race whose history has ever been thought worth asking for. I hope to improve my opportunity. I consider it to be a duty in all classes for each member of the class." "Oh, you may skip about that," said Carl. "I don't care about it." "I am afraid," said the right shoe, "I am uninteresting. My excuse is that I never was fitted to be anything else. Not to press upon people's notice is the very lesson we are especially learned. We were never intended to occupy a high position in society, and it is reckoned an unbearable fault in us to make much noise in the world." "I say," said Carl, "you may skip that." "I beg pardon," said the shoe. "I was coming to the point. Step by step is our family motto. However, I know young people like to get over the ground at a leap. I will do it at once. My brother and I are twins, and as much alike as it is possible, perhaps, for twins to be. Mr. Peg the cobbler thought we were exactly alike, and our upper leathers did indeed run about in the same calf, as perchance they may another time, but our souls were once further apart than they are ever like to be for the future, one having roamed the green fields of Ohio on the back of a sturdy ox, while the other was raised in Vermont. However, we are mates now, and having been, as they say, cut out for each other, I have no doubt we shall jog on together perfectly well. We are rather an old pair of shoes. In fact, we have been on hand almost a year. I should judge from the remarks of our friend Mr. Peg, when he was beginning upon us, that he was very unaccustomed to the trade of shoe-making. Shoe-mending was what he had before lived by, or perhaps I should rather say tried to live by. I'm afraid it was hard work, and I suppose Mr. Peg acted upon the excellent saying, which is also a motto in our family, that it is good to have two strings to one's bow. It was in a little light front room, looking upon the street, which was Mr. Peg's parlour and shop and workroom, that he cut out the leather and prepared the soles for this, his first manufacture. I think he hadn't stuff enough but for one pair, for I heard him sigh once or twice as he was fidgeting with his pattern over my brother's upper leather till it was made out. Mr. Peg was an oldish man, with a crown of grey hairs all round the back part of his head, and he sat to work in his shirt sleeves, and with a thick, short leather apron before him. There was a little fireplace in the room, with sometimes fire in it and sometimes not, and the only furniture was Mr. Peg's little bit of a counter, the low rush-bottomed chair in which he sat to work, and a better one for a customer, his tools and his chips, by which I mean the scraps of leather which he scattered about. Hardly had Mr. Peg got the soles and the upper leathers and the vamps to his mind, and sat down on his chair to begin work, when a little girl came in. She came from a door that opened upon a staircase leading to the upper room, and walked up to the cobbler. It was a little brown-haired girl, about 9 or 10 years old, in an old calico frock and pantalettes. She was not becomingly dressed, and she did not look very well. "Father," she said, "Mother's head aches again." The cobbler paused in his work and looked up at her. "And she wants you to come up and rub it. She says I can't do it hard enough." Rather slowly, Mr. Peg laid his upper leather and tools down. "Will you close this shoe for me, Sue, while I am gone?" He spoke half pleasantly and half, to judge by his tone and manner, with some sorrowful meaning. So the little girl took it, for she answered a little sadly, "I wish I could, Father." "I'm glad you can't, dear." He laid his work down and mounted the stairs. She went to the window and stood with her elbows leaning on the sill, looking into the street. It is only a small town, that Beachhead, but still, being a sea-coast town, there is a good deal of stir about it. The fishermen from the one side and the farmers from the other with their various merchandise, the busy boys and odd forms of women forever bustling up and down, make it quite a lively place. There is always a good deal to see in the street, yet the little girl stood very still and quiet by the window. Her head did not turn this way and that. She stood like a stupid person, who did not know what was going on. A woman passing up the street stopped a moment at the window. "How's your mother today, Sue?" "Oh, she's getting along slowly, Mrs. Binch." "Does the doctor say she is dangerous any?" "The doctor don't come any more." "Has he give her up?" "Yes, he says there's nothing to do but to let her get well." "Oh, she's so smart, is she?" "No, ma'am, she's not smart at all, he says." But Mrs. Binch had passed on, and was out of hearing, and the little brown head stood still at the window again, leaning now on one hand. It was a smooth-brushed, round little head seen against the open window. By and by another stopped, a lady this time, a lady dressed in black, with a grave, sweet, delicate face. "How's your mother, Sue?" "She's just the same, Mrs. Lucy." "No better?" "Not much, ma'am. It'll take a long time, the doctor says." "And are you, poor little tot, all alone in the house to do everything?" "No, ma'am. There's father." The sweet face gave her a sort of long, wistful look, and passed on. Sue stood there yet at the window, with her head leaning on her hand, and whatever was the reason, so dull of hearing that her father had come down, seated himself in his work-chair, and taken up his shoe several minutes before she found it out. Then she left the window and came to him. "What shall I do, father?" "She'll want you directly," said the cobbler. "She's asleep now." Sue stood still. "Don't you want some dinner, Sue?" She hesitated a little and then said, "Yes." "Well, see, dear, and make some more of that porridge, can you?" "Yes, father, and there's some meal yet, and there's some bread too." "You may have that," said the cobbler, "and I'll go out by and see if I can get a little money. Mr. Shipham had a pair of boots new soled a month ago, and Mr. Binch owes me for some jobs, if I ever could get hold of them." And the cobbler sighed. "If only people knew, they would pay you, father, wouldn't they?" "There is one that knows," said the cobbler, "and why they don't pay me he knows. Maybe it's to teach you and me, Sue, that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God doth man live," his little daughter went on softly, as if she were filling up the words for her own satisfaction. "But didn't we know that before, father?" "Maybe we didn't know it enough," said the cobbler. "I'm afraid I don't now." And as her back was turned, he hastily brought his hand to his eyes. "But, father, can one help feeling a little bad when when things are so now." "A little bad. Perhaps one might feel a little bad," said the cobbler. "But if I believed all that I know, I don't see how I could feel very bad. I don't see how I could, and I oughtn't to." His little girl had been raking the fire together and setting on the coals a little iron skillet of water. She turned and looked at him when he said this, as if she had not known before that he did feel very bad. He did not see the look, which was a startled and sorrowful one. He was bending over his shoe leather. She left the room then and went after the meal, which she brought in a yellow earthen dish, and began silently to mix for the porridge. "The Bible says, Father," she began, stirring away. "Yes, dear, what does it say?" said Mr. Peg. "It says, 'Trust in the Lord and do good, so shall thou dwell in the land, and verily—'" Susan's voice broke. "Verily thou shalt be fed," said the cobbler. "Yes, I know it. The thing is to believe it." "You do believe it, Father," Susan said softly. "Aye, but I haven't trusted the Lord, nor done good, any to speak of. It'll stand good for you, daughter, if it doesn't for me." She had stirred her meal into the skillet, and now, setting down her dish, she came to his side, and putting her 2 arms round his neck, she kissed him all over his face. The cobbler let fall leather and ends, and hugged her up to his breast. "That's done me more good than dinner now," said he, when he had, albeit tearfully, given her 2 or 3 sound kisses by way of finishing. "You may have all the porridge, Susie." "There's enough, Father, and there's some bread too." "Eat it all up," said the cobbler, turning to his work again, maybe to hide his eyes. She stood leaning on his shoulder, just so as not to hinder the play of his arm. "Shall I keep the bread for supper, Father?" "No, dear, maybe I'll get some money before supper." "Whose shoes are those, Father?" "They aren't anybody's yet." "Whose are they going to be?" "I don't know. The first pair of feet that come along that will fit 'em. If I sell these, I'll get some leather and make more." "Is that the last of your leather, Father?" "Aye, the last big enough. The rest is all pieces." She stood a little while longer, laying her head on his shoulder, then came a knocking upstairs, and she ran away. The cobbler wrought at his shoe for a space, when turning his head he dropped everything to go and see after the porridge, and he squatted over the fire, stirring it till such time as he thought it was done, and he drew back the skillet. He went to the foot of the stairs and looked up and listened for a minute, and then left it and came back without calling anybody. It was plain he must eat his dinner alone. His dinner was nothing but porridge and salt, eaten with what would have been a good appetite if it had had good thoughts to back it up. And the cobbler did not seem uncheerful, only once or twice he stopped and looked a good while with a grave face into the fire or on the hearth. But a porridge dinner, after all, could not last long. Mr. Peg set away his plate and spoon, placed the skillet carefully in the corner of the fireplace, took off his leather apron and put on his coat, and taking his hat from the counter, he went out. There were no more stitches set in the shoe that afternoon, for Mr. Peg did not get home till dark. The first thing that happened after he went away, a gust of wind blew round the house and came down the chimney, bringing with it a shower of soot, which must have sprinkled pretty thick upon the open skillet. Then the wind seemed to go up the chimney again and could be heard whistling off among the neighbouring housetops. A little while later, Susie came down and made for her skillet. She pulled it out and fetched her plate and spoon, and began to skim out the soot, but I suppose she found it pretty bad, or else that it would lose her a good deal of the porridge, for one time she set her plate and spoon down on the hearth beside her and laid her face in her apron. She soon took it up again, but she didn't make a large meal of the porridge. She went upstairs then immediately, and when she came down the second time it was near evening. She stood and looked about to see that her father was not come in. Then she built up the fire, and when it was burning stood and looked into it, just in the same way that she had stood and looked out of the window. Suddenly she wheeled about, and coming behind the counter took her father's Bible from a heap of bits of leather where it lay, and went and sat down on the hearth with it, and as long as there was light to see she was bending over it. Then when the light faded she clasped her hands upon the shut Bible, and leaning back against the jamb fell fast asleep in an instant, with her head against the stone. There she was when her father came home. Her feet were stretched out upon the hearth and he stumbled over them. That waked her. By the glimmering light of the embers something could be seen hanging from Mr. Peg's hand. "Have you got home, Father? I believe I got asleep waiting for you. What have you got in your hand?" "Fish! Oh, Father!" You should have heard the change of little Sue's voice when she spoke that. Generally her way of speaking was low and gentle like the twilight, but those 2 words were like a burst of sunshine. "Yes, dear. Blow up the fire so you can see them. I've been to Mrs. Binch's. I've been all over town almost. And Mrs. Binch's boy had just come in with some, and she gave me a fine string of 'em. Nice blue fish, there." Susan had made a light blaze, and then she and the cobbler admired and turned and almost smelt of the fish for joy. "And shall we have one for supper, father?" "Yes, dear. You have some coals and I'll get the fish ready right off. Has mother had all she wanted today?" "Yes, father. Mrs. Lucy sent her some soup and she had plenty. And I saved the bread from dinner, father. Isn't it good? And there's more porridge too." What a bed of coals Sue had made by the time her father came back with the fish nicely cleaned and washed. She put it down, and then the two sat over it in the twilight and watched it broil. It was done as nicely as a fish could be done, and Susan fetched the plates and the salt and the bread, and then the cobbler gave thanks to God for their supper, and then the two made such a meal. There wasn't a bone of that fish but was clean picked, nor a grain of salt but what did duty on a sweet morsel. There was not a scrap of bread left from that supper, and I was as glad as anything of my tough nature can be, to know that there were several more fish besides the one eaten. Sue cleared away the things when they had done, ran up to see if her mother was comfortable, and soon ran down again. Her step changed too. "Now, darling," said her father, "come and let us have our talk by this good firelight." She came to his arms and kissed him, and his arms were wrapped round her, and she sat on his knee. "It's one good thing you haven't lights to work, so we can talk," said Sue, stroking his face. "If you had, we couldn't." "Maybe we would," said the cobbler. "Let us talk tonight of the things we have to be thankful for." "There's a great many of them, father," said Sue with her twilight voice. "The first thing is that we know we have a friend in heaven, and that we do love and trust him." "Oh, father," said Sue, "if you begin with that, all the others will not seem anything at all." "That's true," said Mr. Peg. "Well, Sue, let's have them all. You begin." "I don't know what to begin with," said Sue, looking into the fire. "I have you," said her father, softly kissing her. "Oh, father, and I have you. But now you are taking the next best things." "I shouldn't care for all the rest without this one," said the cobbler. "Nor I shouldn't mind anything but for this," he added somewhat. "But, father, you mustn't talk of that tonight. We are only going to talk of the things we have to be grateful for." "Well, we'll take the others tomorrow night, maybe, and see what we can make of them." "Go on, Susie," said the cobbler, putting his head down to her cheek. "I have my dear little child, and she has her father. That's something to thank God and to be glad for. Every day." "So I do, every day, father," said Susan very softly. "And so do I," said the cobbler. "And while I can take care of thee, my dearest, I will take trouble for nothing else." "Now you are getting upon the other things, father," said Sue. "Father, it is something to be thankful for that we can have such a nice fire every night, and every day if we want it." "You don't know what a blessing 'tis, Sue," said her father. "If we lived where we couldn't get driftwood, if we lived as some of the poor people do in the great cities without anything but a few handfuls of stuff to burn in the hardest weather, and that wretched stuff for making a fire. I'm glad you don't know how good it is, Sue," said he, hugging his arms round her. "There isn't a morning of my life but I thank God for giving us wood when I go about kindling it." "How do they do in those places without wood?" said Sue, sticking out her feet towards the warm, ruddy blaze. "He who knows all only knows," said the cobbler gravely. "They do without. It seems to me I would rather go without eating and have a fire." "I don't know," said Sue thoughtfully, "which I would rather. But those poor people haven't either, have they?" "Not enough," said the cobbler. "They managed to pick up enough to keep them alive somehow." And he sighed, for the subject came near home. "Father," said Sue, "I don't believe God will let us starve." "I do not think he will, my dear," said the cobbler. "Then why do you sigh?" "Because I deserve that he should, I believe," said the cobbler, hanging his head. "I deserve it for not trusting him better. Casting all your care upon him, for he careth for you." "Ah, my dear, we can't get along without running to our upper storehouse pretty often." "Father, I guess God don't mean we should." "That's just it," said the cobbler. "That is just no doubt what he means. Well, dear, let's learn the lesson he sets us." "Then, father," said Sue, "don't you think we have a good little house? It's large enough and it's warm." "Yes, dear," said the cobbler. "Some of those poor people we were talking about would think themselves as well off as kings if they had such a house to live in as this. And it is in a pleasant place, father, where there are a great many kind people." "I hope there are," said the cobbler, who was thinking at the moment how Mr. Shipham had put him off, and Mr. Dill had dodged him, and Mr. Binch had fought every one of his moderate charges. "Why, father," said Sue, There's Mrs. Lucy every day sends things to Mother, and Mrs. Binch gave you the fish, and Mrs. Jackson came and washed ever so many times, and Mrs. Gelatin sent the pudding and other things for Mother, you know. Yes, it seems that womankind is more plenty here at any rate than mankind. Why, Father, said Sue. I hope you'll never know, dear, he answered. It was a foolish speech of mine. And I'm sure it's a blessing, Father, that we have so many things sent for Mother. She has almost as much as she wants, and things we couldn't get. Now, Mrs. Lucy's soup, you don't know how nice it was. I tasted just the least drop in the spoon, and Mother had enough of it for today and tomorrow. And then the doctor says she'll get well by and by, and that will be a blessing. It was a blessing so far off that both the cobbler and his little daughter looked grave as they thought about it. And I'm well, Father, and you're well, said Sue pleasantly. Thank God, said the cobbler. And Father, don't you think it's a little blessing to live near the sea, and to have the beautiful beach to walk upon, and see the waves come tumbling in, and smell the fresh wind? We used to go so often, and maybe by and by we shall again. Don't you think it is a great deal pleasanter than it would be if Beach Head was away off in the country, out of sight of the water? Ah, Sue, said her father, I don't know. I've lived a good piece of my life in one of those inshore places, and I didn't want to hear the sea roar then a days, and I could get along without the smell of salt water. No, you don't know what you are talking about exactly. Every sort of place that the Lord has made has its own prettiness and pleasantness, and so the sea has. But I love the green pasture fields as well as I do the green field of water, to this day. But one might be in a place where there wasn't the sea nor the pasture fields either, Father. So one might, said the cobbler. Yes, there are plenty such places. The sea is a blessing. I was thinking of my old home in Connecticut, but the world isn't all green hills and seashore. There's something else in it, something else. Yes, dear, I love those big waves too. And then, Father, said Sue, laying her hand on his breast, we come back to the best things that you were beginning with. Aye, said the cobbler, clasping his arm round her, and for a little space they sat silent and looked into the fire, and then he went on. Poor as we sit here, and weak and dying as we know we know that we have a tabernacle on high, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. It won't matter much, Sue, when we get there. What would not matter, the cobbler did not say. There was something came in his throat that stopped him. It won't matter, Father, said Sue softly. They sat still a good while. The flame of the bits of brands in the chimney leaped up and down, burned strong and then fell outright, and the red coals glowed and glimmered in the place of it, but with less and less power. Now, Sue, let's read, said the cobbler on a sudden. She got up, and he put on the coals 2 or 3 pieces of light stuff, which soon blazed up. While he was doing this, Sue brought the Bible. Then she took her former place in her father's arms, and he opened the book and read by the firelight, pausing at almost every sentence. Praise ye the Lord. We will do that, Sue, said the cobbler, for ever. Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord, that delighteth greatly in his commandments. You do that, Father, said Sue softly. I do fear him, I do delight in his commandments, said the poor cobbler. I might a great deal more. But see how it goes on. His seed shall be mighty upon earth. The generation of the upright shall be blessed. No doubt of it, only let us see that we are upright, my child. Wealth and riches shall be in his house. Yes, Father, but don't you think that means the other kind of riches too? I don't know, said the cobbler. If it does, we shall have them. But I don't know, daughter, see? Wealth and riches shall be in his house, and his righteousness endureth forever. It seems as if that riches had to do with the righteousness. You know what Jesus said, I counsel thee to buy me of gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich. I guess it is the kind of riches of that man who is described as having nothing, and yet possessing all things. Well, so we do, Father, don't we? Let us praise him, said the cobbler. Unto the upright there ariseth light in the darkness. What a promise. Unto the upright again, said Sue. Mind it, dear Sue, said her father, for we may see darker times than we have seen yet. Sue looked up at him gravely, but did not speak. Unto the upright there ariseth light in the darkness. He is gracious, and full of compassion, and righteous. That is the upright man, said Sue. A good man showeth favour and lendeth. He will guide his affairs with discretion. Surely he shall not be moved for ever. The righteous shall be in everlasting remembrance. You remember who says, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. Thy walls are continually before me. That is Zion, Father, isn't it? Said Sue. And just before that, Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget, yet will I not forget thee. We oughtn't to be afraid, father, said Sue softly. I am not afraid, said the cobbler. The righteous shall be in everlasting remembrance. He shall not be afraid of evil tidings. His heart is fixed, trusting in the Lord. There it is, Sue. His heart is established. He shall not be afraid, until he see his desire upon his enemies. He hath dispersed, he hath given to the poor. His righteousness endureth for ever. His horn shall be exalted with honour. The wicked shall see it and be grieved. He shall gnash with his teeth and melt away. The desire of the wicked shall perish. The cobbler closed the book, and he and his little daughter knelt down, and he prayed for a few minutes. Then they covered up the fire, and they went away upstairs together. And the night was as quiet in that house as in any house in the land. The next morning the cobbler and his daughter broiled another fish, but the breakfast was shorter and a less talkative affair than the supper had been. After breakfast the cobbler sat down to his work. But before the shoe was half an hour nearer to being done, Sue appeared at the bottom of the stairs with, Father, Mother says she wants a piece of one of those fish. The cobbler's needle stood still. I don't believe it is good for her, said he. She says she wants it. Well, can't you put it down, my daughter? Yes, father, but she says she wants me to put her room up, and she's in a great hurry for the fish. Mr. Peg slowly laid his work down. Sue ran upstairs again, and the cobbler spent another half hour over the coals and a quarter of a blue fish. Sue came for it, and the cobbler returned to his work again. It was a pretty cold day. The wind whistled about and brought the cold in, and every now and then Sue came down and stood at the fire a minute to warm herself. Every time the cobbler stayed his hand and looked up and looked wistfully at her. Never mind, father, said Sue. It's only that I'm a little cold. You're blue, said he. And at last Mr. Peg couldn't stand it. Down went the leather one side of him and the tools the other, and he went and lugged an armful or two of sticks upstairs and built a fire there, in spite of Sue's begging him to keep on with his work and not mind her. But we shan't have wood enough, father, she said at last gently. I'll go at nights to the beach and fetch a double quantity, said the cobbler, till your mother is able to come downstairs. That I can do. I can't bear the other thing if you can. And Sue stayed upstairs, and the cobbler wrought after that pretty steadily for some hours. But in the middle of the afternoon came a new interruption. 2 men came into the shop and gave an order or two to the cobbler, who served them with unusual gravity. When is court day, Sheriff? He asked in the course of business. Tomorrow itself, Mr. Peg. Tomorrow, said the cobbler. What's the matter? Comes the wrong day. It always does. I had forgot all about it, said the cobbler. Can't I be let off, sir? From what? Said the other man. Why, it's rather an ugly job, some think, returned the sheriff. He's got to sit on the jury that is to try Simon Ruffin. I must beg to be let off, said the cobbler. I am not at all able to leave home. You must tell the court then, said he who was called the sheriff. But it won't do any good, I don't believe. Everybody says the same thing pretty much. They don't any of them like the job. But you see, this is a very difficult and important case. A great many have been thrown out. It is hard to get just the right men, those that are altogether unobjectionable, and everyone knows you, Mr. Peg. But my family want me, said the cobbler. They can't do without me at home. Can't you let me go, Mr. Packham? Not I, said the sheriff. That's no part of my privilege. You must ask the court, Mr. Peg. Tomorrow, said the cobbler. Yes, tomorrow, but I tell you beforehand it won't do any good. What excuse can you make? My family want my care, said the poor cobbler. So does every man's family, said the sheriff. He's a happy man that don't find it so. You haven't much of a family, Mr. Peg, have you? If you had my 7 daughters to look after, well! Mr. Gibbs, shall we go? They went, and sitting down again in his chair, the poor cobbler neglected his work, and bent over it with his head in his hand. At length he got up, put his work away, and left the room. For a while his saw might be heard going at the back of the house. Then it ceased, and nothing at all was to be heard for a long time, only a light footstep overhead now and then. The afternoon passed, and the evening came. The cobbler was the first to make his appearance. He came in, lighted the fire which had quite died out, and sat down as he had sat before, with his head in his hand. So his little daughter found him. She stepped lightly, and he did not hear her till her hand was on his shoulder. Then she asked him what was the matter. "Oh, nothing that should make me sit so," said the cobbler, rousing himself. "We've got more fish left yet," said Sue. "Yes, dear, it isn't that, but I've got to go away tomorrow." "Away?" said Sue. "Yes, away to court." "What for, father?" "Why, they've got me down for a juryman, and I'm afraid there'll be no getting off. The sheriff says there won't." "What have you got to do, father?" "Sit on a jury, dear, to decide whether Simon Ruffin is guilty or no." "Simon Ruffin, that shot that man? Oh, father!" "It's pretty bad," said the cobbler. "How long will you be gone?" "I can't tell at all," said the cobbler. "Maybe a day. Oh, they can't take the evidence in 2 days. I don't know whether it will be 2 or 3 days or a week, dear." "A week? And what shall we do?" Sue could not help asking. "If I can get off, I will," said the cobbler. "But in case I can't, I have, or I will have by morning, as much wood as will do till I come back. I have 2 and 6pence besides, which I can leave you, darling, and I can do nothing more but trust." "Father, isn't it hard to trust sometimes?" Sue said with her eyes full of tears. The poor cobbler wrapped her in his arms and kissed them away, but he did not try to answer. "Maybe it won't do us any harm after all," said Sue more brightly. "Or maybe you'll be able to come back, father. Father, you know we are to talk over tonight the things that we have that we can't be thankful for." "In everything give thanks," said the cobbler. "Yes, father, but it doesn't say for everything." "Perhaps not," said the cobbler. "Well, darling, we'll see. Let's have our supper first." "We'll have the biggest fish tonight, father." The fish wasn't just out of the water now, but it was eaten with a good will, not quite so cheerily as the first one the night before, and Sue sighed once or twice as she was putting the dishes away, and didn't step quite so lightly. Then she came to her former place in her father's arms, and her head stooped upon his shoulder, and his cheek was laid to her forehead, and so they sat some minutes without speaking. "Come, father," said Sue, "will you talk?" "Yes, dear, let us tell over what we have to bear and see how we can bear it. We must go to our upper storehouse again for that, father." "Aye, dear, always." "The first thing, I suppose," said Sue, "is that we haven't quite money enough." "We have just what God gives us," said the cobbler. "I'll never complain of that." "Why, you never complain of anything, father, but it isn't pleasant." "No, dear," said the cobbler, "and yet if we had money enough, could we trust God as we do? It is a sweet thing to live at his hand directly, to feel that it is feeding us today, and to know that it will tomorrow. For was he ever a wilderness to Israel? No, dear, I don't mean to say that poverty is not hard to bear sometimes, nor I don't mean to say that I wouldn't give you plenty of everything if I had it to give, but I do say that there is a sweet side even to this. Father, our blue fish wouldn't have tasted as good if we had always plenty of them." "I suppose not," said the cobbler with a little bit of a stifled sigh. "And maybe we shouldn't know how to love each other quite so well, Sue." "Oh, yes, we should," said Sue. "I don't know," said the cobbler. "I shouldn't know what my little daughter can do and bear if she had not had a chance to show me." "Why, I don't have much to bear, father," said Sue. "Mother wouldn't know what a good nurse you can be." "I wish she hadn't had a chance to know that, father." "Yes," said the cobbler. "Your mother's sickness, that seems the hardest evil we have had to do with. It's not easy to find any present comfort of that, nor any present good, for I am afraid it makes me more impatient than patient. Maybe that's why I have it. But if we can't see the reason of a great many things now, we shall by and by. We shall know, Sue, what the reason was. Thou shalt remember all the way which the Lord thy God led thee these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble thee, and to prove thee, to know what was in thine heart, whether thou wouldst keep his commandments or no." Sue lifted up her head, and her little face was beautiful for the strong patience and bright trust and love that was in it. Her eyes were swimming and her lips were speaking, though they only moved to tremble. "We can wait, Sue," said the cobbler gently. Sue laid down her head again. "So it seems we have got the reason of it already," Mr. Peg went on, "if not the good." "Maybe we've got some of the good too, without knowing it," said his little daughter. "Still, we'll be very glad to have Mother get well." "Oh, won't we?" said Sue. "And it will teach us how to be thankful for the common things we forget." There was a little pause. "Then you would like to have me go to school," said Sue, "and I can't." "And if you could, I shouldn't have the pleasure of teaching you myself," said the cobbler. "I can bear that." "But then I can't learn so many things," said Sue. "Of one kind you can't, and of another kind you can," said her father. "I don't believe there's a schoolgirl in Beach Head that can broil a blue fish as you can." "Oh, father, but then you showed me how." "Do you think broiling bluefish comes by nature?" said the cobbler. "I can tell you there are many people that can't learn it at all, and that's only one of your accomplishments." "Oh, father," said Sue again, smiling a little. "You can nurse a sick mother, and mend a hole in your father's coat, and put up a room and make a bed with anybody. Still, father, you'd like to have me go." "Yes, I would," said the cobbler. "Maybe I shall never be sorry by and by that I couldn't." "And then, father," said Sue, "you can't get work enough." "Yes," said the cobbler. "If I could do that, it would all be smooth. But God could give it to me if it pleased him, and if it don't please him, there must be some reason. Can't we trust him and wait?" Sue looked up again, not so brightly as once before, meekly and rather tearfully. "And then I must leave you tomorrow," said her father, kissing her brow. "And that seems just now the worst of all." "Maybe you'll come back again, father," said Sue. "I am afraid I shall not, till this trial is over." "It's a disagreeable business, isn't it, father?" "Very disagreeable, as ugly as can be to look at." They were silent a while. "Maybe there'll be some good come of it somehow, after all," said Sue in her twilight voice. "Good will be the end of it," said the cobbler. "There's a kind hand doing it, and an almighty arm upholding us in it. We shall not be utterly cast down. So we must bear to be poor, and to be sick, and to be separated, and just leave it all with God." "Father, it's pleasant to do that," said Sue, but you could know by the tone of her words that she was crying a little. "Why, darling, if we are poor and sick and in trouble, we have our dear Saviour, and we know that the Lord is our God. We are not poor people, not we, having nothing and yet possessing all things. Who would we change with, Sue?" She had to wait a little while before she spoke, but then she said, "I wouldn't change with anybody." "No more would I," said the cobbler, giving her another kiss. And so they went to bed, a couple of very rich, poor people. But the house looked poor the next day, empty and cold. The cobbler was off betimes, the little breakfast fire died out, dust lay on the counter, the tools and the unfinished work were here and there, the wind slipped in and slipped out again, and nothing else paid us a visit except Sue, who once or twice looked in and looked round as if to see whether her father was there. Once she came into the room and stood a few minutes with her little brown head and her quiet grave face, looking at the ashes in the fireplace and the neglected work, and her father's chair with a wistful sort of eye. It said, or seemed to say, that however she felt last night, she would be very glad today if they were not poor, not sick, not separated. She looked pale and weary too, but she did not stay long to rest or think. Her feet could be heard now and then upstairs. The cobbler did not come home. The night darkened upon just such an afternoon as the morning had been. The next day began in the same manner. Towards noon, however, the outer door opened, and in came a puff of fresh, cold air and another visitor, who looked fresh, but not cold at all. It was a boy about 13 or 14, healthy, ruddy, bright-eyed, well-dressed, and exceedingly neat in his dress. He came in like one familiar with the place, and took note of all the unusual tokens about, as if he knew well what was usual and what was unusual. He looked at the cold chimney and scattered work. He went to the foot of the stairs and stood listening a moment, and then coming away from there he loitered about the room, now going to the window and now to the chimney, evidently waiting. He had to wait a good while, but he waited. At last he had what he wanted. For tired with being upstairs or wanting to gather some news from the outer world, Sue slowly came downstairs and showed her little face at the stairway door. And almost before it had time to change, the newcomer had called out, "Sue?" And with an unknown light breaking all over her face, Sue exclaimed joyously, "Roswald!" and springing across to him laid her sweet lips to his with right goodwill. "Oh, you've got back," said Sue, with a gladsomeness it did or would have done anyone's heart good to hear. "Here I am." "Haven't I been a long while away?" "Oh, so long," said Sue. "But what's the matter here, Sue? What's become of you all?" "Why, Mother's sick, you know. She hasn't got well yet, and Father's away." "Where is he?" "He had to go to court. He had to be a juryman to try Simon Ruffin. And we hoped he would be able to get leave to come away. We wanted him so much, but he hasn't been able to come." "He's been away since yesterday morning? Who's taking care of you?" "Why, nobody," said Sue. "Is there nobody in the house with you?" "Nobody but Mother. Father left wood enough already." "Wood enough for how long?" "Oh, for a good many days." "Aren't you afraid?" Why no, Roswald. Who goes to market for you, Sue? Nobody. What do you live on? Oh, people send Mother nice things. Mrs. Lucy sent her a whole pail of soup the other day. How big a pail? Why, Roswald, I mean a nice little tin pail, so big. And do you live on soup too? No, said Sue. On what then? Oh, on what there is. Exactly. And what is there? Mrs. Binch gave Father a string of blue fish the other night, and since then I have made porridge. What sort of porridge? Cornmeal porridge. Why, Sue, do you live on that? Why, porridge is very good, said Sue, looking at him. But there was a change in his eye, and there came a glistening in hers, and then she threw suddenly her 2 arms round his neck and burst into a great fit of crying. If Roswald had been a man, his arm could not have been put round her with an air of more manly and grave support and protection, and there were even 1 or 2 furtive kisses, as if between boyish pride and affection, but affection carried it. I don't know what made me cry, said Sue at last, rousing herself after she had had her cry out. Don't you? Said Roswald. No, it couldn't have been these things, because Father and I were talking about them the other night, and we agreed that we didn't feel poor at all. At least, of course we felt poor, but we felt rich too. How long have you been living on porridge? I don't know. Have you had a fine time, Roswald? Yes, very. I'll tell you all about it sometime, but not now. Is Merrytown as pleasant as Beach Head? It is more pleasant. More pleasant, said Sue. Without the beach and the waves, Roswald? Yes, it is, and you'd say so too. You'd like it better than anybody. There are other things there instead of beach and waves. You shall go down there sometime, Sue, and see it. I can't go, said Sue meekly. Not now, but some day. Sue, haven't you any money? I've 2 and 6pence that Father gave me, but I was afraid to spend any of it for fear he or Mother might want it for something. I must, though, for I haven't got but a very little Indian meal. Sue, have you had dinner today? Not yet. I was just coming down to see about it. Your mother don't eat porridge, does she? Oh no, she's had her dinner. Well, will you let me come and eat dinner with you? Sue brought her hands together with again a flush of great joy upon her face, and then put them in both of his. How good it is you have got back, she said. It will take that porridge a little while to get ready, won't it? He said, beating her hands gently together and looking as bright as a button. Oh yes, it'll take a little while, said Sue. I haven't got the water boiling yet. Have you got meal enough for both of us? Yes, I guess so. Plenty. Just then Mrs. Lucy opened the front door and brought her sweet face into the room. She looked a little hard at the 2 children and asked Sue how her mother was. Roswald bowed, and Sue answered. May I go up and see her? Sue gave permission. Mrs. Lucy went up the stairs. Roswald stopped Sue as she was following. Sue, I'll go to market for you today. Give me 2pence of your money and I'll get the meal you want. Oh, thank you, Roswald, said Sue. That will be such a help. And she ran for the pennies and gave them into his hand. I'll be back presently, said he, and then I'll tell you about things. Run up now after Mrs. Lucy. I don't believe I need, said Sue. They don't want anything of me. Run up, though, said Roswald. Maybe Mrs. Lucy will ask your mother too many questions. Why, that won't hurt her, said Sue, laughing. But Roswald seemed in earnest, and she went up. Immediately Roswald set himself to build a fire. He knew where to go for wood, and he knew how to manage it. He soon had the hearth in order and a fine fire made ready, and it was done without a soil on his nice clothes and white linen. He was gone before Mrs. Lucy and Sue came down, but the snapping and sparkling in the chimney told tales of him. Why, he has made the fire for me, cried Sue, with a very pleased face. Who made it? Said the lady. Roswald. That boy that was here when I came? Yes, ma'am, he has made it for me. Who is he? He is Roswald Halifax. What, the son of the widow, Mrs. Halifax? Yes, ma'am. And how came you to know him so well? Why, I have always known him, said Sue. That is, almost always. I used to know him a great many years ago when I went to school, and he always used to take care of me and give me rides on his sleigh, and go to the beach with me, and he always comes here. Is he a good boy? Oh, yes, ma'am, he's the best boy in the whole place, Sue said, with kindling eyes. I hope he is, said Mrs. Lucy, for he has no one to manage him but his mother. I fancy he has pretty much his own way. It's a good way, said Sue decidedly. He is good, Mrs. Lucy. Does your mother want anything in particular, Sue? Sue hesitated and looked a little troubled. "Tell me, dear, now while your father is away you have no one to manage for you. Let me know what I can do." "Oh, Roswald would manage for us," said Sue, but what?" The lady's manner and tone were very kind. Sue looked up. "She has nothing to eat, ma'am." "Nothing to eat?" "No, ma'am, and I've only 2 shillings and 6pence. 2 shillings and 4pence, I mean, to get anything with. And I don't know what to get. She can't eat what we can." "Have you nothing more to depend on but that, my child?" "That's all the money we have, ma'am." "And what have you got in the house besides? Tell me, dear. We are all only stewards of what God gives us, and what you want perhaps I can supply." Sue hesitated again. "We haven't anything, Mrs. Lucy, but a little Indian meal. Roswald is going to buy me some more." "Are your father's affairs in so bad a condition, my child?" "He can't get work, ma'am. If he could, there would be no trouble, and what he does he can't always get paid for." "And how long has this been the case, dear?" "A long time," said Sue, her tears starting again. "Ever since a good while before Mother fell sick. A good while before. And then that made it worse." Mrs. Lucy looked at Sue a minute, and then stooped forward and kissed the little meek forehead that was raised to her, and without another word quitted the house. Sue, with a very much brightened face, set about getting her porridge ready, evidently enjoying the fire that had been made for her. She set on her skillet and stirred in her meal, and when it was bubbling up properly, Sue turned her back to the fire and stood looking and meditating about something. Presently away she went, as if she had made up her mind. There was soon a great scraping and shuffling in the back room, and then in came Sue, pulling after her with much ado a big empty wooden chest, big enough to give her some trouble. With an air of business she dragged it into the middle of the room, where it was established solid and square, after the fashion of a table. Sue next dusted it carefully, and after it the counter and the chairs and mantel-shelf. The floor was swept clean always, and Sue herself, though in a faded calico, was as nice in her ways as her friend Roswald. Never was her little brown head anything but smooth brushed, her frock clean, her hands and face as nice and pure as nature had meant them to be. Roswald looked as if soil could not stick to him. When the room was in a due state of nicety, Sue brought out and placed the 2 plates, the salt cellar with the little wooden spoon in it, the tumblers of blown glass, a pitcher of water and the spoons. She had done then all she could, and she turned to watch her porridge and the front door both at once, for she did not forget to keep the porridge from burning, while her eye was upon the big brown door at every other minute. The porridge had been ready some time before the door at last opened, and in came Roswald, bearing a large market basket on his arm. "It is astonishing," said he as he set it down, "what a heavy thing Indian meal is." "Why, Roswald," said Sue, "did you get all that with 2 cents?" "No," said Roswald. "The basket I borrowed. It is my mother's." "But have you got it full?" said Sue. "Pretty full," said Roswald complacently. "I never thought 2 cents would buy so much," said Sue. "Didn't you?" said Roswald. "Ah, you're not much of a market woman yet, Sue. My arm is tired." "I'm sorry," said Sue, "but I'm so glad you've got it for me." "So am I. Now is that porridge ready?" "Ready this great while," said the little housekeeper, carefully dishing it out. "It's been only waiting for you." Roswald looked at her with a curious, gentle, sorrowful expression, which was as becoming as it was rare in a boy of his years. "Are you hungry, Sue?" "Yes," said Sue, looking up from her dish with a face that spoke her perfectly satisfied with the dinner and the company. "Aren't you?" "Why, I ought to be. The air is sharp enough to give one an appetite. Sue." "What?" "Do you eat your porridge alone?" And sitting down, with an air of determination, he drew the porridge dish quite to his end of the chest table, and looked at Sue as much to say, "You don't touch it." "What does that mean?" "Aren't you going to let me have any?" said Sue, laughing. "No." "Why not?" "I shall want all the porridge myself. You'll have to take something else, Sue." "But I haven't got anything else," said Sue, looking puzzled and amused. "Well, if you give me my dinner, it's fair I should give you yours," said Roswald. And rising, he brought his market basket to the side of the table and sat down again. "It's a pity I can't serve things in their right order," he said, as he pulled out a quantity of apples from one end of the basket. "But you see the dinner has gone in here head foremost. I never saw anything so troublesome to pack. There's a loaf of bread now that has no business to show itself so forward in the world, but here it comes. Sue, you'll want a knife and fork." and he set a deep, longish dish with a cover on the table, and then a flat, round dish with a cover. Sue looked stupefied. Roswald glanced at her. "Your appetite hasn't gone, Sue, has it?" But she got up and came round to him and put her face in her 2 hands down on his shoulder and cried very hard indeed. "Why, Sue," said Roswald gently, "I never expected to see you cry for your dinner." But Sue's tears didn't stop. "I'll put all the things back in the basket if you say so," said Roswald, smiling. "I don't say any such thing," said Sue, lifting up her tearful face and kissing his cheek, and then she went round to her seat and sat down with her head in her hands. Roswald, in his turn, got up and went to her and took hold of her hands. "Come, Sue, what's the matter? That isn't fair. Look here, my porridge is growing cold." And Sue laughed and cried together. "Dear Roswald, what made you do so?" "Do how?" "Why, do so. You shouldn't. It was too good of you." Roswald gave a merry little bit of a laugh and began to take off the covers and put them on the counter. "Come, Sue, look up. I want my porridge and I am waiting for you. Where shall I get a knife and fork? In the pantry in the back room?" Sue jumped up, wiping away her tears, and ran for the knife and fork. And from that time, throughout the rest of the meal, her face was a constant region of smiles. "A roast chicken! Oh, Roswald! How Mother will like a piece of that, how good it smells." "She's had her dinner," said Roswald, who was carving. "You must take a piece of it first. I ought, in conscience, to have had a separate dish for the potatoes, but my market basket was resolved not to take it. Some salt, Sue?" Sue ran for another knife and fork and then began upon her piece of chicken, and Roswald helped himself out of his dish and ate, glancing over now and then at her. "You can't think how good it is, Roswald, after eating porridge so long," said Sue, with a perfectly new colour of pleasure in her face. "This is capital porridge," said Roswald. "I'll trouble you for a piece of bread, Sue." "Why, Roswald, are you eating nothing but porridge?" "Yes, and I tell you I should like a piece of bread with it." "Ah, do take something else," said Sue, giving him the bread. "The porridge will keep to another time." "I don't mean it shall, much of it," said Roswald. "It's the best dinner I've had in a great while." Sue laid down her knife and fork to laugh at him, though the doing so had very near made her cry again. "Please take some chicken, Roswald." "I'd rather not. I'll take a piece of pie with you presently." "I should think chicken was enough," said Sue. "You needn't have brought me pie." "I wanted some. It's a mince pie, Sue. Do you remember that the day after tomorrow is Christmas?" "Christmas? The day after tomorrow?" said Sue. "No, I had forgotten all about Christmas. What shall we do to keep it?" "Why, nothing, I shan't," said Sue meekly. "I shall not eat porridge, Roswald. Oh, if Father would only come home! That would be enough keeping of Christmas. We wouldn't want anything else." "I'll tell you how it's going to be kept out of doors," said Roswald. "It is fixing for a fine fall of snow. The air is beginning to soften and grow hazy already. I like a snowy Christmas." "With snow on the ground, but not snowing?" said Sue. "Yes, both ways. Now, Sue, have you another plate, or will you take it in your fingers?" Sue ran off for plates. "How I wish I could give some of this to Father," she said as she tasted her first bit of pie. "How will he get anything to eat, Roswald?" "Oh, they will take care of that," said Roswald. "He will have a good dinner, Sue. You needn't be concerned about it. If they didn't feed their jurymen, you know, they might have no jury by the time the case was got through, and that would be inconvenient. Hasn't he been home at all?" "No." "They do sometimes let them come home," said Roswald, "but in this case I suppose they are keeping everybody tight to the mark." "Why shouldn't they let them come home at night?" said Sue. "What would be the harm? They must sleep somewhere." "They are afraid, Sue, that if they let them out of sight, someone may talk to them about the case and put wrong notions into their heads, so that they won't give a true verdict." "And what is a verdict?" said Sue. "It's the jury's decision. You see, Sue, all the people, all the lawyers on both sides, will bring all the proof they can to show whether Simon Ruffin did or didn't shoot Mr. Bonnycastle. One side will try to prove he did, and the other side will try to prove he didn't. The jury will hear all that is to be said, and then they will make up their minds what is the truth. When they are ready, the judge will ask them, 'Gentlemen, are you agreed upon a verdict?' And the foreman will say, 'Yes.' Then the judge will ask, 'Is the prisoner at the bar guilty or not guilty?' And the foreman will say, according as they have decided, 'Guilty or not guilty.' And that answer is the verdict." "And then he will be hung," said Sue. "If they find he is guilty, he will. But they don't condemn him, that's the judge's business. The jury only decide what is the truth." "Why must they have so many men to do that?" Why wouldn't one do as well? It would if they could always be sure of having a man who couldn't and wouldn't make a mistake. It isn't likely that 12 men will make all the same mistake. And must they all be agreed, said Sue. They must all be agreed. And if they are not, the man can't be hanged. No, nor set free. I'm glad of that, said Sue. Why, Sue? Because if father isn't sure that man is guilty, I mean that he shot Mr. Bonnycastle, he won't let them do anything to him. It's well you can't be a juryman, Sue. You would never let any rogue have his rights. Yes, I would, said Sue gravely, if I thought he deserved them. I wouldn't trust you, said Roswald. I should like to have you on the jury if I was standing a trial for my life. You'd be challenged, though. Challenged, said Sue. Yes. What is that? Why, Simon Ruffin, for instance, might say, Mr. Pegg is an old enemy of mine. He has a spite against me. He would not be a fair judge in my case. That would be challenging your father as an improper juryman, and he would be put out of the jury. But father isn't anybody's enemy, said Sue. No, I know he isn't, said Roswald, smiling, but that's an instance. Will you have some more pie, Sue? No, thank you. I'll put these things away and see if mother wants anything. Then if she doesn't, I'll come down and we'll talk. While Sue cleared away the dishes, Roswald mended the fire. You may as well let the table stand, Sue, said he. We shall want it again. Why, are you coming to eat with me again? Said Sue, laughing. I dare say I shall if your father don't come home, said Roswald. Sue soon came downstairs, for her mother luckily did not want her, and the two drew their chairs together and had a very long conversation, in the course of which Roswald gave many details of his stay at Merrytown, and enlightened Sue as to the charms and beauties of a country village. Sue looked and listened and questioned and laughed, till there came a knocking upstairs, and then they separated. Sue went up to her mother again, and Roswald left the house. The room did not look desolate any more, though it was left again without anybody in it. There was the chess table, and the contented-looking fire, and the two chairs. All this while we shoes lay in the corner, and nobody looked at us. It seemed as if we were never to get done. The fire had died when Mrs. Lucy came again. Her knock brought Sue down. She had come to bring another little pail of soup, and a basket with some bread and tea and sugar. Don't spend your money, my child, she said. Keep it till you need it more. This will last your mother tomorrow, and I will see that you have something stronger than porridge. Oh, I have, Mrs. Lucy, said Sue with a grateful little face, which thanked the lady better than words. I've got plenty for I don't know how long. You don't look as if you were out of heart, said Mrs. Lucy. You know who can send better times. Oh, yes, ma'am, said Sue. He has already. Trust him, dear, and let me know all you want. Sue stood sober and silent while Mrs. Lucy went out at the door, and then she fell down on her knees before one of the chairs and sunk her head in her hands, and was quite still for a minute or two, till the knocking sounded again. It was not a gentle tap on the floor just to let Sue know she was wanted. It was an impatient, quarrelsome, vexatious rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat, rat-tat, rat-tat. Sue ran up. The cobbler did not come home that night, and Roswald would stay in the house. Sue did all she could to hinder him, for indeed there was nothing for him to sleep on but the pile of leather scraps. But he would not be hindered. But your mother, Roswald, Sue gently urged. What of my mother? She will want you. How do you know that? Well, I should think she would, said Sue. Should you? Well, she thinks, and so do I, that you want me more. How good you are, dear Roswald. Not very, Sue, said Roswald calmly. Do you know what Mrs. Lucy says, said Sue. She says that you have your own way in everything. Mrs. Lucy might have gone wider of the mark, I suppose, said Roswald, blowing up the fire. Mrs. Lucy is very good, said Sue. She brought us some tea and sugar this afternoon. Did she? Said Roswald. Then what will you do with what Mrs. Halifax sent? Did she send us some? Said Sue. Oh, Roswald! Roswald laughed at her, and Sue did not know what to do with herself. She went and fetched down a quantity of coverlids and things for Roswald to wrap himself in and be warm during the night, and begged him to keep a good fire. The next day still the cobbler did not come home. It passed with no visitors except Roswald and Mrs. Lucy, who stepped in for a minute. Sue's mother wanted her upstairs pretty much the whole day, so there could be little fun going. Christmas Eve Roswald stayed in the house again, but he went off very early in the morning, without seeing Sue, after he had made the fire for her. The snow had not come so soon as Roswald thought it would. There was none on the ground Christmas Eve, but when Christmas morning rose, the whole of Beach Head was softly and smoothly covered with white, It had fallen very fast and quietly during the night. The windowsills were piled up, the doorknob was 6 inches high, and the snow hung like thatch over the eaves of the houses. The streets were a soft, pure, printless spread of white. So they were early when Roswald first went out, and whatever kept people's feet within doors, whether the dark morning, for the snow still fell, or happy Christmas delays, there was yet hardly a footprint but his to be seen in that part of the street when, some hours later, a sled drawn by a horse and carrying 2 men and a barrel drew up before Mr. Peg's door. Sue had heard the tinkle of the 3 bells which the horse bore on his neck, and as it told of the first sleighing that year, she went to the window to see. There was the sled and 1 man and the barrel. The other man had jumped off and was knocking at the front door. Very queer, thought Sue. What can they want here? But she ran downstairs and opened the door. The barrel was rolling up over the snow to the house, and the 2 men were behind pushing it. The cold air and the yet falling snow, and the white street, the men, and the barrel rolling up towards Sue. Sue was bewildered, but that barrel must go somewhere, and she held the door open. "What is it?" said Sue. "It doesn't belong here, does it?" "There's Mr. Peg on it," said one of the men, "and this is Mr. Peg's house, ain't it?" "What is it?" said Sue in astonishment, as the barrel now stood up on end at the end of her chest table. "It's a barrel of flour, I guess," said the man. "Looks like it, and it come from Mr. Hooneman's." "Flour," said Sue. But the men with their heavy snowshoes clumped out again and shut the door behind them with a bang. Sue stood and looked. There was the barrel, full-sized, standing on end, one side of it still lightly coated with snow, and there were the snow marks on the floor of the feet that had been there. It wasn't a dream. It was a real barrel, and even the snow wasn't in a hurry to melt away. Suddenly it flashed into Sue's little mind that it might be a Christmas present, and then whoever sent it ought to have been there when the unwanted rosy colour sprang to her cheeks and made her for a minute look like a well-to-do child, and whoever sent it ought to have seen, a minute after, the bended head and heard the thanksgiving that was not spoken, and the prayer earnest and deep for a blessing on the friend that had sent it. Sue had lifted her head but had not moved from a foothold when Roswald opened the door. "Oh, Roswald, do you see this?" "Merry Christmas, Sue," said Roswald gaily. "Oh, Roswald, do you know what this is?" "It is very like a barrel of flour," said Roswald. "I should be surprised if it was anything else." "But Roswald, who sent it?" "Why, Sue, Santa Claus, to be sure. Don't you know what day it is?" "It didn't come down the chimney," said Sue. "That I know." "Dear Roswald, don't you know who sent it?" "If Santa Claus had taken me into his confidence, you know, Sue, it would not be an honest thing to betray. I wonder what you can do with a barrel of flour now you have got it." "Do?" said Sue. But just then there was another knock at the door. Roswald opened it. In came a boy with a long string of fine black and blue fish, which Mrs. Binch had sent to Sue. "Beachhead is waking up," said Roswald. "Oh, Roswald," said Sue, beginning to get into the spirit of the thing. "Did you ever see anything like those fish? Oh, tell Mrs. Binch I thank her a great many times, please, a great many times. I am very obliged to her, and so is father. Oh, Roswald, do see." "There's your mother knocking, Sue," said Roswald. "Run off and I'll take care of these fish. You get ready for breakfast." Sue went off in one direction and Roswald in another. He was the first to come back with a beautifully cleaned fish, which he soon had upon the coals. He went on to set the table and get the bread and the tea, and by that time Sue came, as happy and as humble as possible to enjoy her breakfast. Whether or not Roswald had had another breakfast before, he at any rate kept her company in hers, both talking and eating. The fish was declared to be the finest that could come out of the sea, and Roswald was probably adjudged to be the best cook on land. If he had been, his work could not have given better satisfaction. Roswald had to go away after breakfast, and told Sue his mother would want him at dinner, and he could not be there again before evening, but then he would come. Sue was satisfied with everything. Her day was spent for the most part upstairs, but there were some breaks to it. A servant came in the course of the morning bringing some bottles of wine for her mother, from Mrs. Halifax. Sue was already in a state of happiness that could hardly be heightened, and was in fact endeavouring to bear it with the help of her Bible, for it was in her hand whenever she came downstairs. But her eyes sparkled afresh at this gift, because it came from Mrs. Halifax, and because it was what her mother wanted. Sue could not wait, She begged the man to open one of the bottles for her, which with no little difficulty was done without a corkscrew, and then, when he had gone, Sue poured out a little into a teacup and went upstairs with such a face. Joy and love were dancing a waltz in it. A little before noon there came another knock at the door. A modest knock this was, so gentle that Sue probably did not hear it. The knocker had not patience, or was not scrupulous. He opened the door halfway and pushed in a square wooden box, nailed up and directed, after which he went away again, leaving it to tell its own tale. It seemed to tell nothing that Sue could understand. She looked at it when she next came down with all her eyes and on all sides, but it was fast nailed up. She could not by any means open it, and she could not tell what was inside. She easily guessed that it was another Christmas, but in what form? She sat and looked at it with a face of infinite delight. She walked round it. Nothing was to be made of it but a pine box, tolerably heavy, with her own name and her father's, in large black letters on the upper side. Those letters did look lovely. Sue read them a great many times that day, and sat and gazed at the wooden box, but she could do nothing with it till Roswald came. He came at last, towards the edge of the evening. Sue was watching for him. "Oh, Roswald, there you are. Here's another." "Another what?" said Roswald gravely. "Another Christmas present. Look here." "Looks very like Christmas," said Roswald. "Oh, dear Roswald, won't you get a hammer?" "A hammer," said Roswald. "I suppose Mr. Joyce will lend me one." He went to borrow it and opened the box. Sue watched with breathless interest while the hammer did its work, and the pieces of the cover came up one by one. "Now, Sue," said Roswald, as he stepped back and began to draw the nails out of the wood. Sue drew the things out of the box with slow and cautious fingers that seemed almost afraid of what they found. She did not say a word, but one or two half-breathed "ohs." There was a nice and complete outfit of clothes for her. On the top lay a paper written with, "For little Sue Pegg, from some friends that love her." When she got to the bottom, Sue looked up. "Oh, Roswald, who sent me these?" "Some friends of little Susan Pegg that love her," said Roswald. "Did you know about it?" "I heard my mother speak about it, Sue." "Did she do it?" "Not she alone. Mrs. Lucy and some other ladies all had a hand in it." "Oh, how good they are." It was long before Sue could get up from the box. Roswald stood, hammer in hand, looking at her and smiling. At last Sue packed the box again. "I don't deserve it all," she said. "But then, I don't deserve anything. Now I guess we'll have some tea." "I'll go and carry back this hammer," said Roswald, "and then I'm ready. I'm very thirsty." "Oh dear, Roswald," said Sue. "Won't you just open that barrel of flour first? It will save going for the hammer again, and Mother thinks she wants some pop robin." "But what's pop robin good for without milk?" said Roswald as they went to the barrel, which he had rolled into the pantry. "Oh, now I might get a halfpenny's worth of milk," said Sue. "It's for Mother, and now we have so many things we might afford it." "See you don't," said Roswald. "Mother sends you word. Oh, there are enough nails in this barrel head. She says you may have as much milk as you want from her cow whenever you will come for it, or I will bring it. So between us, I guess it'll be safe to count upon it." He was hammering at the barrel head, and Sue standing by looking very pleased, her little hand gratefully resting on his shoulder, when another hand was laid on hers. Sue turned. "Father!" she exclaimed. "Oh, Father, are you home? Oh, I'm so glad." The cobbler's grey head was stooped almost to the barrel top, and Sue's arms were round his neck, and how many times they kissed each other I don't believe either of them knew. It seemed impossible for Sue to loose her hold. "And you are here, my boy," said the cobbler, turning to Roswald, "doing my work?" "No, sir, I have been doing mine," said Roswald. "Oh, Father, he has taken such care of me," said Sue. "I warrant him," said the cobbler. "If I could only have known that Roswald Halifax was in town, I could have minded my business with some quietness." "And is it done, Father?" said Sue. "It is done, my child." "And what have you done with that man?" "We have declared him, upon our judgment, not guilty." "Oh, I'm so glad," said Sue. They came back to their tea, all three, and more blackfish were broiled, and all the Christmas was told over, and well nigh all the trial. The jury had been kept in all Christmas Day to agree upon their verdict. From that day the cobbler's affairs improved. Whether his friends exerted themselves to better his condition now that they knew it, or whether Mr. Ruffin's friends did, or whether neither did, but other causes came into work, certain it is that from that time the cobbler's hands had something to do, and more till they had plenty. So it came to pass that this poor pair of shoes didn't get finished till about a month ago, and then Mr. Krinken must take it into his head that we would fit his little boy, and bought us, for which we owe him a grudge, as we wanted decidedly to spend our lives with Mr. Peg and his little brown-headed daughter. "Did Mrs. Peg get well?" said Carl. "Yes, long ago, and came downstairs. But she was no improvement to her family, though her getting well was." "I am very sorry that story is done," said Carl. "I want to hear some more about Roswald Halifax." "There is no more to tell," said the shoe. If Carl had been puzzled on Friday as to what story he would hear, he was yet more doubtful on Saturday. There lay the pine cone, the hymn book, and the stocking on the old chest, and there sat Carl on the floor beside them, sometimes pulling his fingers, and sometimes turning over the 3 remaining storytellers by way of helping him to make up his mind. As a last resort, he was taking a meditative survey of the ends of his toes, when a little shrill voice from the chest startled him, and the pine cone began, without more ado. The Story of the Pine Cone. "Whew," said the north wind. "Whew." The fir trees heard him coming, and bowed their tall heads very gracefully, as if to tell the wind he could not do much with them. Only some of the little ones who had never blown about a great deal felt frightened, and said the wind made their teeth chatter. "Do you think we can stay on?" asked one little cone, and the others would have said they didn't know, but the wind gave the tree such another shake that their words were lost. "Whew," said the wind. And again the fir trees bowed to let him pass, and swayed from side to side, and the great branches creaked and moaned and flung themselves about in a desperate kind of way, but the leaves played sweet music. It was their fashion whenever the wind blew. "I think we shall have snow," said the tallest of the fir trees, looking over the heads of his companions. "The sky is very clear," remarked a very small and inexperienced fir, who was so short he could not see much of anything. "Yes," said the tall one, "so you think, but there is a great deal of sky besides that which is over our heads, and I can see the wind gathering handfuls of snow clouds, which he will fling about us presently." "Yes," repeated the tall fir with another graceful bend, "I see them. They are coming." The evergreens were all sorry to hear this, for nothing depressed them so much as snow. The rain they could generally shake off, at least if it didn't freeze too hard. As for the beeches, they said that if that was the case they must put off their summer clothes directly, and one little beech, with a great effort, did succeed in shaking off 6 green leaves the next time the wind came that way. "You need not hurry yourselves," said the tall fir. "This is only an early storm. The winter will not come yet. I can still see the sun for a few minutes every day." And that was true. For a few minutes the sun shewed himself above the horizon, and then, after making a very small arch in the sky, down he went again. Then came the long afternoon of clear twilight, and the longer night, when the stars threw soft shadows like a young moon, and looked down to see their bright eyes in the deep fjord that lay at the foot of the fir trees. For this was on the north side of Norway, and the fir trees grew by one of the many inlets of the sea, which run far away for miles into the country, and are called fjords. At the mouth, the fjord was so narrow, and the overhanging trees so thick, that you might have coasted along backwards and forwards without perceiving the entrance. But to the country people it was well known, and unmistakably marked out by one particular hemlock. Pushing your little boat through its green branches that dipped their finger in the water, the fjord opened before you. The banks on each side were for the most part very steep, and often wooded to the water's edge, while sometimes a pitch of bare rocks and a noisy cataract came rough and tumble down together, pouring disturbance into the smooth waters of the fjord. The fjord itself was too beautiful to be half described. It wound about from rock to rock, now swashing gently at the base of a high mountain, and then turning and spreading out bay-like where the shore was lower and the hills stood aloof, but everywhere overhung or nodded to by the great trees that looked as if they had known it since it was a mere rill. The beeches and oaks and hemlocks, the tall pines like a ship's main mast, and most of all by that glory of those forests, the Norway spruce fir. These watched the fjord everywhere, in the regions of perfect solitude, and in the spots where a little clearing, a waft of blue smoke, the plaintive bleat of a goat mounting up the world, or a hearty bow-wow of some hardy little dog that was minding his own business and everybody else's, told of a human habitation. Back of all, beyond cliff and wood and everything but the blue sky, towered up the peaks of perpetual snow, whose bare heads no man had ever seen. The fjord could not point heavenward after that fashion, but it reflected every bit of blue that came over it, and even when the skies were dark and the snow peaks hid their heads in a cloud, the fjord's reflections were only grave and thoughtful, never gloomy. And the water was so clear. Sailing along in a little boat, you could look down for 20 fathoms and see the smooth white sand, with little shells and starfish. And then the bottom of the fjord rose suddenly up like a rocky mountain, over which the boat passed into a deep gulf on the other side. Then came a plain and great forests far down in the water, through which large fishes swam softly about, and then another mountain. In one of the narrowest parts of the fjord, a little spot of cleared and cultivated land lay like a smile between it and the rough mountain. A mere point of land, a little valley wedged in among the heights that rose cliff beyond cliff towards the blue sky, fringed here and there with fir trees. The valley smiled none the less for all this roughness, and the little dwelling that there found a foothold seemed rather to court the protection of the cliffs and to nestle under their shelter. The house was as such best suited to the place. It was built of great pine logs, roughly squared and laid one upon another, with layers of moss between, while every crevice and crack was well stuffed with the same. The roof was of boards, covered with strips of birch bark, and over all a coating of earth 2 or 3 inches deep, in which a fine crop of moss had taken root. The windows were large and well glazed with coarse glass, while very white curtains hung within, and the door was painted in gay colours. Other little huts or houses stood about, forming a sort of square, and furnishing apartments for the pig, the cows, and their winter provision, while one more carefully built than the rest held all manner of stores for the family. Raised upon posts that the rats might not enter, the little alpabod kept safe the fish, the venison, the vegetables, even the cloth, yarn, and sometimes clothing of its humble owners. In sight of the house, a little way down the fjord, was a wild ravine, skirted on one side with a height of thick woods and rocks, while on the other the rocks stood alone, the sharp ridge rising up hundreds of feet to a ledge in some places not a foot wide. On either side the ridge the pitch was very sheer down, the one depth being filled with forest trees which led on to the wooded hill beyond, while the ravine on the other echoed to the voice of a waterfall, that pouring down over a pile of rocks perhaps 200 feet high, foamed into the fjord, which then came eddying past the little hut, bearing the white flakes yet on its blue water. This was all one could see in the valley, but the tall fir trees looked at tall ranges of wooded hills and rocky cliffs, with the fjord in its further windings, and beyond all the snow mountains. "How cold you must be up there," said a little pine who was nearly as high as the tall fir's lower branches. But the fir did not hear him, or perhaps did not take notice, for he was looking off at the fine prospect. "Yes, it is cold up here," answered one of the fir cones, "and windy, and there's a great deal of sameness about it. It's just snow and rain and wind and sunshine, and then snow again." "That's what it is everywhere," said the wind as he swept by. "I can't help it," said the cone. "I am tired of it. I want to travel and see the world and be of some use to society. What can one do in the top of a fir tree?" "Why, what can a pine cone do anywhere?" said some of the beech mast. "The end of a pine cone's existence is not to be eaten up, however," retorted the cone sharply. "Neither am I a pine cone, though people will call me so. We firs hold our heads pretty high, I can tell you. But I will throw myself into the fjord some day and go to sea. I have no doubt I could sail as well as a boat. It would be a fine thing to discover new islands and take possession." "It would be very lonely," said a squirrel who was gathering beech mast. "Royally so," said the pine cone. "There one would be the king of all the trees." "The trees never had but one king, and that was a bramble," said a reed at the water's edge who was well versed in history. "What nonsense you are all talking," said the tall fir tree at length. "My top leaf is at this moment loaded with a snowflake. There is something sensible for you to think of." At this moment the hut door opened, and a woman came out. She wore a dark stuff petticoat made very short, with warm stockings and thick shoes. A yellow close-fitting bodice was girdled round her waist, and from under it came out a white kerchief and very full white sleeves. On her head she wore a high white cap. She looked first at the weather, and then turning towards the fall she watched or listened for a few minutes. But water and rocks and firs were all that the eye or ear could find out. Then going up to a line stretched between two of the fir trees, she felt of some things that hung there to dry. "I suppose that was her clothes line," said Carl. "No, it wasn't," replied the cone. "I might rather call it her bread line. The things that hung there were great pieces of the inner bark of the pine tree, and looked very much like sheets of foolscap paper." "She didn't make bread out of them, I guess," said Carl. "Yes, she did," replied the cone. "She made many a loaf of bark bread by pounding the dry bark and mixing it with flour. It wasn't particularly bad bread either. So people say. I never tasted it. But the country folks in Norway use it a great deal in hard seasons, and in those woods you often meet pine trees that have been stripped of their bark, and that have been dried and bleached in the weather till they look as if made of bone or marble. Well, the pieces of bark were dry, and Norska began to take them off the line, for of course the snow would not improve them. "Who was Norska?" interrupted Carl. "The good woman that came out of the house. She took them down, and when they were all in a heap at the foot of the tree, she began to carry them off to the Alpabod. That is the little storehouse I spoke of. Then she went back into the hut for a minute, and when she came out again, she had on a long-sleeved grey woolen jacket and her lure in her hand." "What's that?" said Carl. "The lure is a long trumpet-shaped thing made of hollow pieces of wood or pieces of birch bark, tied together and 4 or 5 feet long." "What was it for?" said Carl. "Why, you shall hear if you have patience," said the cone. Norska raised the lure with one hand, and putting her mouth to the little end, there came forth of the other sundry sweet and loud sounds, which echoed back and forth among the rocks till they died away, far up the mountain. "But I say," said Carl, "what for?" And he took hold of the pine cone and gave it a little pinch, but it was pretty sharp, and he let go again. The pine cone settled himself down on the chest, looking just as stiff as ever, and then went on with his story. Norska sounded her lure twice or thrice, and presently the head and horns of a red cow shewed themselves high among the rocks. Then came in sight her shoulders and forefeet, and her hind feet and tail, and the whole cow began to descend into the valley, while a dun cow's head shewed itself in just the same place and fashion. But when Norska had once seen that they were coming, she ceased to watch them, and turned to the fall again. Its white foam looked whiter than ever in the gathering dusk. The grey clouds which were fast closing in overhead sent down a cold grey light, and the water before it broke no longer sparkled with the sun's gay beams, but looked leaden and cold and deep. Then, breasted with snow like the stormy petrel, it came flying down the precipice to plunge into the deep fjord below. Its very voice seemed changed, for the wind had died away, and the steady roar of the water was the only sound that broke the hush. There was no living creature in sight, unless a little lemming peeped out of his hole, or an eagle soared across the sky, a mere speck upon its clouds. The cows had reached the valley, and now stood quietly chewing the cud, having had the precaution to turn their backs to the wind. And now Norska fetched the milk pails, and drove the red cow up to the milking corner, and as she went a snowflake fell on her forehead, and another fell on top of her head, and the fir trees sighed, and bowed their heads to what they couldn't help. Norska sighed too. "The winter is coming," she said, "and the snow, and truly the Alpabod is but poorly filled. And Sneeflocken sick, and laughed not home from Lofoden, and Klein, what can keep him?" And again she looked towards the fall. Klein was there now. She could see him plain enough, though he was but a little spot on that sharp ridge by the waterfall. The path itself was hard to find, as it wound over and under and around the points of rock that met on the ledge. A stranger could scarce have climbed it but on hands and knees, yet down there came Klein, sure-footed as a chamois, swiftly down and singing praises of the rocks and streams and woods and snow as he came. But before he reached the foot of the hill, Klein's song stopped. With the first look at the hut, his thoughts had outrun his feet, and with a quieter step now he came down into the valley and up to where his mother sat milking the red cow. In one hand was a gun, in the other a string of golden plovers. "How late, Klein?" said Norska. "Yes, mother. I tried to get a shot at a reindeer." "How is she?" Norska silently pointed to a snowflake which, falling on her hand as she talked, had lain for a moment in all its pure beauty, but was now melting fast away. She watched till it disappeared, and then bending her head lower than ever, she resumed her work. Klein stood silent and thoughtful. "Maybe not, Mother," he said at length. "Her appetite has been better lately. See, I have these plovers for her tonight, and tomorrow I will have the deer. Think of my finding one in these parts." But his mother said no more, and when the pails were full, Klein took them from her and carried them into one of the little huts, and then returning, he drove the cows into their little log dwelling, and taking up his birds and gun, he walked slowly to the house. But the gaily painted door was out of tune with his mood, and he turned and went round the back way. Leaving both gun and birds in the kitchen, Klein opened softly a door leading to one of the bedrooms and went in. The corners of this room and the sides of the windows were boarded, and the floor was strewed with fresh twigs of the juniper tree, which gave a sweet smell through the room and made it look pretty too. Of the 3 windows, 2 looked towards the fjord and 1 to the mountain and over the little clearing. The bed stood in a recess that had doors like one of your cupboards, but these were now open, and by the bedside stood a little white pine table, and upon it a wooden bowl and spoon, all prettily carved. "How were they carved?" said Carl. The bowl had carved upon it a spray of the wild bramble, twining round with its leaves and berries, and the handle of the spoon was like a wild duck's head, and the feet of the table were like bear's feet. Klein had done it all, for in Norway the men and boys carve a great deal and very beautifully. And this bowl and spoon had been made for his little sister as he sat by her bedside. And Klein was very proud of them. The feathers on the duck's head were beautifully done, and the brambleberries looked pretty enough to eat, but Klein did not once look at them now, for something far prettier lay on the bed, and that was little Sneeflokken. "What did they call her that for?" said Carl. "Because that is the name of the snowflakes, and she was just as pure and fresh as they, and had never had the least bit of colour in her cheeks from the time she was a baby. You could scarcely have distinguished them from the pillow, but for the fair hair that came between. She was covered with a quilt made of down, for Klein had risked his life almost in climbing to the high difficult places where the eider ducks build their nests, that he might get the soft down which the mother duck plucks from her own breast to keep her eggs and nestlings warm. And Norska had made it into a quilt, the warmest thing that could be, while the weight of it was almost nothing. And beneath this soft quilt Sneeflokken lay with her eyes closed and singing softly to herself in the Norse language a hymn. Klein had to step back into the shadow of the door of the recess to wipe the tears off his face before he could venture to speak to his little sister. But she spoke first. "Klein?" "What, dear?" said her brother, coming forward. "I thought I heard your step," said Sneeflokken with a smile, and putting up her lips to kiss him. "Where have you been all day?" "Oh, over the mountains, hunting," said Klein as cheerfully as he could. "I saw a great big reindeer, Flokken, and I mean to go and find him tomorrow. That would fill the alpabod nicely, and you would like some venison, wouldn't you, dear?" "Oh yes," said Flokken with a little smile, "but I wouldn't kill the deer for that." "I would," said Klein, "and it would help Mother too." "I should like to help Mother if I could," said Sneeflokken, putting her little thin hands together. "But Jesus will. I have asked him." "Why, you help us all," said Klein, "just as the birds do when they sing or the sun when it shines." "Maybe I shall by and by," said the child, smiling again in that grave, quiet way. "Yes, by and by, when you grow up to be a strong woman," said Klein. "No, Klein," said Sneeflokken, stroking his face. "No, dear Klein, but by and by when I go to heaven. Maybe God will let me help take care of her then, and of you too, Klein. But you will not know that it is your little Sneeflokken." And Klein could only sit and hold her in his arms and say nothing. The snow fell all that night, and the winter set in early, and the waterfall scattered icicles upon every branch and rock in its way, and then built for itself an ice trough through which it poured down as noisily as ever. Then the sun never showed his face but for a few minutes, and the rest of the day was twilight. And at night the moon shone splendidly, and the northern lights showed peaks of fire in the heavens, or sometimes there were only the stars burning clear in the high lift, and twinkling down in the dark fjord between the shadows of the fir trees. Now and then a bear would come out and prowl about the little dwelling, or a wolf gave a concert with the waterfall. But cows and pigs were safe shut up, and Foss the little dog showed so much disapprobation at the concert that often the wolves did not have one for nights together. Laft, the father of Klein, got home from Lofoden with his stock of dried fish, and Klein himself had shot his reindeer, and both meat and fish were safely stowed in the alpabod. Didn't the wolves know that? And didn't their mouths water sometimes at night till they were fringed with icicles? But they never tried to break in, for the alpabod was strong, and little Foss knew as well as the wolves what good things were there, and scolded terribly if everybody and everything did not keep a respectful distance. And besides all that, the wolves were afraid of the light that always shone from one room of the little cottage. "This is a very quiet way of life, ours," said the fir trees, nodding to each other. "I'm very tired of it," said one of the cones. "It's very cold up here, and really in the dark one cannot see to do much." "A fir glories in the frost and the cold and the snow," said the tall tree proudly. "We are not called upon to do anything, to keep it from blowing too fiercely upon the little hut, and to show our fine heads against the sky. The snowbirds are warm in our arms during the long night, for we have plenty of good clothes all the year round." The beeches heard this speech, but were too frost-bound to make any answer. "What became of the discontented pine cone?" said Carl. "Did he throw himself into the fjord?" "Yes," said the cone. "At least one night he tried to, but he fell on the shore instead, just dropped down at the foot of the fir tree, and there Klein found him one day, and picked him up and carried him into the house to show Flocken. He was such a large one. Every night through the winter was that light burning in the same room of the hut, and every day did Klein come out with his gun and spend what daylight there was in hunting. Sometimes he brought home a hare or a ptarmigan, or a partridge that he had snared, or a wild duck, while his father was cutting wood, or away in his boat to catch fish. "I could get only one partridge today, dear Flocken," Klein would say upon his return home, "but maybe I shall find something better tomorrow." "Oh, Klein," said his little sister, "how good you are to take so much trouble for me, but it's a pity to kill the birds. They can't make me live, so we might let them." "Wasn't that a good one you had yesterday?" said Klein. "Oh yes," said Flocken, "it was delicious. I think everything is good that you get for me and that Mother cooks, but then you know I can't eat much." If you had seen her as she lay there, so thin, so white, you might as soon have suspected a very snowflake of eating much. "So it don't make much difference," repeated little Sneeflocken, "what I have. Only I do believe, Klein, that I like to have you take so much trouble and go away up in the snow to get things for me." And she put her arms round his neck, and laying her white face against his coarse grey jacket, she stroked and caressed him, till Klein thought his heart would burst beneath the weight of that little snowflake. "When the spring comes," he said, "we will go up the mountains and look for flowers, and I will make you a wreath of violets and fringed pinks, little Flocken." Sneeflocken stroked his face and smiled, and then she looked grave again. "And forget-me-nots, Klein," she said softly. "You will want them too. The little blue forget-me-nots. They are so like the sky colour. You will think about me, Klein, whenever you see them, for I shall know what the sky is made of then." "Where's Mother?" "She is cooking your partridge," said Klein. "Don't you smell it?" "Oh yes," said the child, smiling. "And I guess the wolves smell it too. How loud they howl." "You are not afraid of them," said her brother tenderly. "No," said Sneeflocken, with a strange look of weakness and trust upon her little face. "No, I am not afraid of them, for the Good Shepherd is very strong. I should be if it wasn't for that. How kind he is, Klein, to think about such poor children as we are, and it's kind of him to take me away too, for I'm not very strong. I don't think I could ever be of much use." "You are of too much use, my little Sneeflocken," said Klein sadly, "because we shouldn't know what to do without you." "Why, you will have me then," said the child, looking up in his face, "just as you have the flowers now, Klein, and you can think about me, and say that some day you will go up and up to find me." "Up to find you?" said Laft, who with Norska had just entered the room. "Are you going to play hide-and-seek with Klein upon the mountains, my little dear?" But Norska asked no such questions, for she knew what Sneeflocken meant well enough. But she brought the roast partridge to the bedside on a little wooden platter that had a row of pine cones carved all round the edge, and sitting down on the bed, she watched the child eat her scanty supper, when Klein had lifted her up and wrapped an old cloak about her. Little Foss had followed them in, and now he sat wagging his tail and beating the floor with it, just because he felt uncomfortable and didn't know what to do with himself, not at all because he smelt the partridge, for he knew perfectly well that Sneeflocken was sick, and when she had finished her supper and called, "Foss, Foss," the little dog ran to the bed, and standing as high as he could on his hind legs, thrust his cold nose into her hand, and whined and whimpered with joy and sorrow. Then in a tumult of excitement, he dashed out of the house to bark at the wolves again. They watched her sew by day and night through the long winter, but before the first spring days came, the little snowflake had melted away and sunk down into the brown earth. They made her grave within the little clearing, just between the house windows and the mountain, where the fir tree shadows could just touch it sometimes, but where the sunlight came as well. And within the little white railing that enclosed the grave, they placed an upright slab of wood, upon which Klein had carved these words as Norska desired him. Say unto her, Is it well with thee? Is it well with thy husband? Is it well with the child? And she answered, It is well. The grass grew green and fresh there, and the little blue forget-me-nots that Klein had planted about the grave soon covered it with their flowers. And sometimes, when Klein stood there leaning over the paling, he almost fancied that it was as she said, that God had sent her to take care of them, and that it was not the soft spring wind which stroked his face, but the hand of his little Sneeflokken. He thanked God that she was safe in the arms of the Good Shepherd, and for the hope that when his time came to go, he should find her in heaven. Were you that discontented pine-cone? Said Carl, when he had sat for some time thinking over the story. Yes, said the cone, and I was carried into the house as I told you, and then, because Sneeflokken had once held me in her little hand, Klein said he would keep me always. But I say, said Carl, knitting his brows and looking very eager, how did you get here? Because other people were as foolish as I was and didn't know when they were well off, said the cone. For Klein was your mother's grandfather, and when he died and she left her home to follow the fortunes of John Krinken, she brought the old pine cone along, to remember the tall fir trees that waved above the old hut in Norway, and to remind her of little Voss and Klein and Sneeflokken. The story of the hymn book. Clary, Clary, wake up, you'll be late. See how late it's getting. Well, Mother, but I'm so tired. What's the good of living so, Mother? One must live somehow, child, till one's time comes to die. Clary did not say, but she thought, as she raised herself slowly from the hard little straw bed, that it did not matter how soon that time came for her. Work, work, living to work and working to live. Working hard too, and for what a pittance of life. Was it living to sleep half as much as she wanted, and then to get up in the cold grey dawn of a winter's morning, get 3 or 4 dirty children out of bed and into such clothes as they had, and then after as much breakfast as she had had sleep, to take that long cold walk in her old straw bonnet and thin cotton shawl to the printing office, there to stand all day supplying the busy ironed fingers of the press. How thin and blue her own were. Poor Clary. In truth, she did not know what it was to live, in the real sense of the word. Her mind looked back to no happier time than the present. For though she could well remember being a dirty little child like her brothers and sisters, with nothing to do but play or quarrel as she felt inclined, yet she by no means wished the time back again. The death of her father and the consequent absence of his bottle and his wild fits of intoxication had left the family in a peaceful state compared with those days, and since Clary had been at the printing office, she had learned to love the sight of decently dressed people, and had begun to take more pains to look nice herself, and above all, had begun to feel that she would like to be happy and well-dressed and respectable, if she only knew how. But they were very, very poor, and there was a little cluster of mouths to fill, as clamorous and wide open as a nest of young swallows, and never saying enough. So though she kept her face cleaner and her hair smoother, and when she could get them, sewed hooks and eyes on her dress, the march of improvement rested there, and her face was as hopeless, her eye as dull as ever. For nobody had ever taught Clary about that one thing needful which can make up for the want of all others. She had never been to church, she had never read the Bible. Indeed, she had none to read. She thought that nothing but money could make them happy. She thought that nobody could want anything but money, and was not really much surprised that people were so loath to part with it. They must be that, she thought, or the poor press tenders could not be so very far removed from the heads of the concern, in comfortable appearance. They must be that, she thought, or the poor press tenders could not be so very far removed from the heads of the concern, in comfortable appearance. There were many of the women indeed that spent more upon their dress than she did. A tawdry silk jacket worked all day at her right hand, and a pair of earrings dangled all day before her, while her own dress was but the coarsest calico. But Clary had somehow begun to wish for neatness and comfort. Of course, finery was forgotten. Never had she been much inclined to envy anybody, till one day the head printer brought his 2 little children to the office, and Clary's heart beat quick time to her sorrowful thoughts all the hours after. Oh, to see those children at home with clean faces and smooth hair and whole frocks and trousers. And now there were rags and dirt and tangled locks, and no time to mend matters, and small stock of soap and combs and needles to mend with. Clary went straight to bed when she got home that night, and it was on the next morning that she awoke with the question, "Mother, what's the use of living so?" But as her mother had said, she must live somehow, and getting wearily out of bed, hastily too, for it was indeed late, Clary easily found her way into such clothes as she had, and then having with some difficulty fastened the children into theirs, she seated them at the table where her mother had by this time placed the breakfast, and herself stood by, drinking a cup of the miserable coffee and tying on her bonnet at the same time. "Going to wash today, Mother?" "Yes." "Then I'll take some bread and not try to come home for dinner." This was the ordinary course of things. Clary at the printing press, and her mother doing day's work for people well off in the world, while the younger children were locked in or locked out, as the case might be. It was a foggy December morning. Not very cold, but with a drizzling mist that was more chilling than snow, and by the time Clary reached the office, she felt as moody and uncomfortable as the weather. It was warm enough in the office, but not very cheering, she thought, though some of the men looked as if they enjoyed life sufficiently well, as with sleeves rolled up they whistled softly over their work, keeping some time with their heads, as if the tune were a particularly lively one. Clary put her bonnet and shawl in their place and went to the press she always tended. It was motionless now, and a man was just putting in a new set of plates. Clary hardly noticed what he was doing. It mattered so little to her what words were printed on those great sheets of paper that she handled every day, though she could read and very well, but she stood listlessly. "What's the matter, Carey?" said the man. "You look dumpish this morning." "I fixed you a new piece of work here that'll be good for that. They say poetry's first rate for the spirits." Something's good for her. She knew the man spoke jestingly. And yet, as he walked off, Clary thought she would look and see what it was that he was talking about. She had seen type enough to be able to spell it out backwards, and bending over the plates, she read at the corner next to her, "Oh, how happy." And then the machine was suddenly put in motion, and not faster could she supply the sheets than the press drew them in, printed them and tossed them out in a nice pile at one end. Clary could not stop for one instant, but she had something to think about. Again and again she repeated those 3 words to herself and wondered of whom they spoke, and what could be the rest of the sentence. She could guess. It must mean the people who were rich and had plenty of clothes and plenty to eat and time to sleep and to walk about in the sunshine. The people who bought the meats that she saw hanging up in the butcher's shops, which she hardly knew by name and much less by taste. The beautiful ladies that she sometimes saw in Broadway when she happened to get through work a little earlier than usual, wrapped up in furs and velvets and looking as if they wouldn't know calico when they saw it. The children that she had seen looking out of carriage windows with little white lapdogs. The curling ears on the head of the dog and the curling feathers on the head of the child seeming to Clary almost equally beautiful. Yes, those must be the happy people, but then she would very much like to know more about them, to read all those stories which the press was no doubt printing off of these same happy people, who were never poor and who had no little ragged brothers and sisters. For the first time in her life, Clary wished the press would get out of order, for some other reason than because she was tired. Her mind worked and worked upon those 3 words, till she was almost wild with the desire to read more. Perhaps it told the way to be rich and happy, and that cruel press kept moving just as fast as it could. Not till 12 o'clock did it make a pause. But at 12 o'clock there was a sudden hush, and hardly had the rollers stopped their rolling before Clary had left her place and gone to that corner of the pile of printed sheets where she knew the words must be. Yes, they were there. She found them easy enough, but what were they? "Oh, how happy are they who the Saviour obey, and have laid up their treasure above." Poor Clary! She could almost have cried over her disappointment, for if the words had been Greek, she could hardly have been more puzzled as to their meaning. As I have said, she had never been to church, she had never read the Bible, and if she ever had heard the Saviour's name, it was from those who spoke it with neither love nor reverence. Her father had been a drunkard. Her mother was a hard-working, well-meaning woman, but as ignorant as Clary herself. No preacher of the gospel had ever set foot in their house, and how should they believe in him of whom they had not heard? So Clary puzzled over the lines and could make nothing of them. The word treasure she did indeed understand, but where it was to be laid up and how were as far from her as ever, and constantly her mind went back to that second line, who the Saviour obey. I wonder if I couldn't do that, she thought to herself, if I only knew how. Mother always said I was good about minding. It must be so pleasant to be happy. It doesn't say that nobody could do it but rich people either. And again she read the words. They were at the bottom of the sheet, and the next might not come to her press at all, or not for some days. She looked over the rest of the sheet. A great many of the hymns she could make nothing of at all. The very words missionary and convert and ransom were strange to her. Then this hymn caught her eye, and she read, "Come to the mercy seat, come to the place of prayer, come little children to his feet, in whom ye live and are. Come to your God in prayer, come to your Saviour now, while youthful skies are bright and fair, and health is on your brow." Clary read no further. That did not suit her, she thought. There was nothing bright about her life or herself. It seemed the old thing again, the happy rich people. She went back and read the first one over. That did not seem so, and she sought further, wearily glancing from hymn to hymn, but with a longing that not even the hard words could check. At last she saw one verse, the first word of which she knew well enough. "Poor, weak, and worthless though I am, I have a rich almighty friend. Jesus the Saviour is his name. He freely loves and without end." The words went right to the sore spot in Clary's heart, the spot which had ached for many a long day. Somebody to love her, a rich friend. If she had written down her own wishes, they could hardly have been more perfectly expressed, and the tears came so fast that she had to move away, lest they should blot the paper. Bitter tears they were, yet not such as she had often shed, for, she knew not how, those words seemed to carry a possible hope of fulfilment, a half-promise, which her own imaginations had never done, and the first line suited her so exactly. Poor, weak, and worthless. I am all that, thought Clary, but if this rich friend loves one poor person, he might another. Jesus the Saviour, that must be the same that the other verse speaks of. How happy are they who the Saviour obey. Oh, I wish I knew how. I would do anything in the world to be happy. And I suppose all these rich people know all about him and obey him, and that makes them so happy. For if he loves poor people, he must love the rich a great deal more. 1 o'clock. The great clock struck, and the people came tramping back to their work, or rose up from the corners where they had been eating such dinner as they had brought. Clary had forgotten all about hers. Certainly it was an easy dinner to forget, but all the afternoon, as the press kept on its busy way, she lived upon those 2 verses which she had learned by heart. She had no chance to read more when they left off work that night, but all the way home she scarce saw either rich or poor for the intentness with which her mind studied those words, and the hope and determination with which she resolved to find out of whom they spoke. She almost felt as if she had found him already. It seemed as if she was less friendless than she had been in the morning, and though once again the remembered words filled her eyes with tears, anyone who knew Clary would have wondered at the step with which she went home. "Where did she read those words?" said Carl, who had listened with deep attention. "On my 222nd page," replied the hymn book, "for it so happened that I was printing that very day." Carl turned to the 272nd page and read the words, and then shutting the hymn book, desired him to go on with his story. "What made you so early, Clary?" said her mother, who had got home first. "Early, is it?" said Clary, when she could get breath to speak, for she had run up all the 3 pairs of stairs to their little room. "It's the same as always, mother, only maybe I walked fast. Oh, mother, I've had such a happy day." "A happy day," said her mother, looking up in amazement at the life of her voice and face that were wont to be so dull and listless. "Well, child, I'm glad on it. You never had many." "Such a happy day," repeated Clary. "Oh, mother, I read such beautiful words at the printing office." "Did you fetch the soap I wanted?" inquired her mother. No, Clary had forgotten it. "Well, don't be so happy tomorrow that you'll forget it again," said her mother. "Every living child here is as dirty as a pig, and no way of making them cleaner. Tidy up the room a little, can't you, Clary? I've stood up on my 2 feet all day." So had Clary, and some nights she would have said as much. But now that new half-hope of being happy, that new desire of doing all that anyone could want her to do, she didn't know why, gave her 2 feet new strength, and she not only tidied up the room, but even found a little end of soap to tidy up the children withal, then gave them their supper and put them to bed with far less noise and confusion than usual. Her mother was already seated by the one tallow candle, making coarse shirts and overalls for a wholesale dealer, and Clary, having at last found her thimble in the pocket of the smallest pair of trousers, sat down to work too. Never had her fingers moved so fast. "Mother," she said after a while, "did you ever hear anybody talk about the Saviour?" Her mother stared. "What on earth, child?" she said. "Where have you been, and who's been putting notions in your head?" "Nobody," said Clary, "and I've been nowhere, only to the office the same as usual. But I read some beautiful verses there, Mother, at dinner time that they were printing off on my press, and they made me feel so, I can't tell you how. But oh, Mother, they told about some great rich friend of poor people like us, Mother, worth nothing at all, they said, and that everybody who obeyed him was happy." "You'd better not plague your head with such stuff," said her mother. "Nobody cares about poor folks like us. Why, child, rich people wouldn't touch us with a pair of tongs. Haven't I seen them draw up their frocks as I went by, because mine was calico, and maybe not over clean because I couldn't buy both soap and bread? I tell you, Clary, rich folks thinks the poor has no right to breathe in the same world with 'em. I don't want to long for one." "I didn't say rich people," said Clary thoughtfully, "but only this one. Poor, weak and worthless though I am, I have a rich, almighty friend. Oh, Mother, I wish I had." "Come, child, shut up," said her mother, but not unkindly, for something in Clary's look and tone had stirred the long-deadened feeling within her. "I tell you, child, we must eat, and how is your work to get done if you sit there crying in that fashion? The candle's most burnt out too, and not another scrap in the house." Clary dried her tears and went on with the overalls until the candle had flickered its last, and then groped her way in the dark to the little bed she and her mother occupied by that of the 5 children. For sleeping all together thus, the coverings went further. Dark and miserable it was, and yet when Clary laid herself down, overtaken at last by the sleep which had pursued her all the evening, the last thought in the poor child's mind was of those hymns. The word on which her heart went to sleep was that name which is above every name. How sweet the name of Jesus sounds in a believer's ear. To Clary's great sorrow and disappointment, when she went next day to the printing office, the pile of printed paper had been removed, and not only so, but a new set of plates given her instead of those of the hymn book. Clary's only comfort was to repeat over and over to herself the words she had already learned, and to try to get at their meaning. Sometimes she thought she would ask the foreman, who was very pleasant and good-natured, but that was only while he was at some other press. Whenever he came near hers, Clary was frightened and held her head down lest he should guess what she was thinking of. And as week after week passed on, she grew very weary and discouraged, yet still clinging to those words as the last hope she had. If she could possibly have forgotten them, she would have been almost desperate. The winter passed and the spring came, and it was pleasanter now to go down to the printing office in the early morning and to walk home at night, and she could hear other people's canaries sing, and see the green grass and flowers in other people's courtyards, and on Sunday, as she had no work, she could sit out on the doorstep, if there weren't too many children about, or walk away from that miserable street into some pleasanter one. She had walked about for a long time one Sunday, watching the people that were coming from afternoon church, and now the sun was leaving the street and she turned to leave it too, taking a little cross street which she had never been in before. It hardly deserved the name of street, for a single block was all its length. The houses were not of the largest, but they looked neat and comfortable with their green blinds and gay curtains, and spring was there in her earliest dress. A green ground, well spotted with hyacinths, snowdrops and crocuses. It was very quiet too, cut short as it was at both ends, and the Sabbath of the great city seemed to have quitted Broadway and established itself there. Upon one of the low flights of steps Clary saw as she approached it, sat a little girl having a book in her hand, with a dress after the very pattern of Spring's, a little warm shawl over her shoulders, and a little chair that was just big enough. She sat there in the warm sunshine which streamed down through a gap in the houses, turning over the leaves of her book. If you had guessed the child's name from her looks, you would have called her Sweet Content. Clary stopped a little way off to look at her, thinking bitterly of the 5 children she had left playing in the dirt at home, and as she stopped, the little girl began to sing. Oh, how happy are they who the Saviour obey, and have laid up their treasure above. The little voice had no more brought these words to Clary's ear when a carriage came rolling by and the rest of the verse was lost. But in an instant Clary was at the house, and feeling as if this were the only chance she would ever have, she opened the little gate and went in. The child ceased singing and looked up at her in some surprise. I want to know, said Clary, and then suddenly recollecting her own poor dress and comparing it with the little picture before her, she stopped short. But the words must come. They were spoken almost before Clary herself was aware. Will you please tell me who the Saviour is? And then blushing and frightened she could almost have run away, but something held her fast. The child's eyes grew more and more wondering. Come in, she said gravely, getting up from her chair, and with some difficulty keeping the book and the little shawl in their places. But Clary drew back. Oh yes, come in, said the child, tucking the little book under her arm and holding out her hand to Clary. Please come in. Mother will tell you. And following her little conductor, Clary found herself the next minute in a pleasant, plain and very neat room. Mother, said the child, opening a door into the next room, but still keeping her eye upon Clary lest she should run away. Mother, here's a girl who never heard about Jesus. I don't understand thee, Eunice, said a pleasant voice, but I will come. And a most pleasant face and figure followed the voice. What did thee say, child? She inquired, with only a glance towards Clary. Tell Mother what you want, said the child encouragingly. Mother, she never heard about Jesus. Thee never heard about him, poor child, said the lady, approaching Clary. And how dost thou live in this world of troubles without such a friend? I don't know, ma'am, said Clary, weeping. We are very poor, and we never had any friends. And a long time ago in the winter I read a verse at the printing office about someone who loved poor people, and I thought maybe he would help us if he knew about us. He knows all about thee now, said the good Mrs. Allen, with a look of strange wonder and pity on her pleasant face. Sit down here, child, and I will tell thee. Didst thou never hear about God? Yes, ma'am, said Clary hesitatingly. I believe I have. Mother says, God help us, sometimes, but we are very poor. Nobody thinks much about us. God is the helper of the poor and the father of the fatherless, said Mrs. Allen, with a grave but gentle voice. Thee must not doubt that. Listen, we had all sinned against God, and his justice said that we must all be punished, that we must be miserable in this world, and when we die we must go where no one can ever be happy. But though we were all so bad, God pitied us and loved us still. Yet he could not forgive us, for he is perfectly just. It was as if we owed him a great debt, and until that debt was paid, we could not be his children. But we had nothing to pay. Then the Son of God came down to earth and bore all our sins and sorrows and died for us, and paid our great debt with his own most precious blood. This is Jesus, the Saviour. Yes, ma'am, said Clary, whose heart had followed every word. That's what the verse said. Jesus the Saviour is his name. He freely loves and without end. She stood as if forgetting there was anyone in the room, her eyes fixed on the ground, and the quiet tears running down from them, her hands clasped with an earnestness that showed how eagerly her mind was taking in that good news, peace on earth and goodwill toward men, which was now preached to her for the first time. Little Eunice looked wistfully at her mother, but neither of them spoke. At length Mrs. Allen came softly to Clary, and laying her hand on the bowed head, she said, Jesus is the friend of sinners, but they must strive to sin no more. Wilt thou do it? Wilt thou love and obey the Saviour who has done so much for thee? A sunbeam shot across the girl's face as she looked up for one moment, and then bursting into tears she said, Oh, if I knew how! Ask him and he will teach thee. Pray to Jesus whenever thou art in trouble, when thy sins are too strong for thee and thy love to him too faint. When thou art tired or sick or discouraged, ask him to love thee and make thee his child. Ask him to prepare a place for thee in heaven. For he hath said, If ye shall ask anything in my name, I will do it. Little Eunice had gone softly out of the room while her mother spoke, and now returned with a little book in her hand, which was quietly placed in Clary's, after a look of assent from her mother. That's a Bible, said Eunice, with a face of great pleasure, and you may have it and keep it always. I wish I had a hymn book for you too, but I've only got this one, and my Sunday school teacher gave it to me last Sunday. But the Bible is the Word of God, and it will tell you all about Jesus, and every bit of it is perfectly true. Oh, you will love it so much. Everybody does who loves Jesus. And won't you come and read in my hymn book sometimes? Yes, "Come very often," said Mrs. Allen, "and we will talk of these things." And with a heart too full to speak, Clary left the house. But oh, what a different walk home! How happy are they who the Saviour obey. She could understand that now, for with the simple faith of a child she believed what had been told her, and with her whole heart received the friend of sinners to be her friend. Her earnest prayer that night, her one desire, was to be his child and servant. To obey him then became sweet work, and thenceforth through all Clary's life, if anyone had called her poor, she would have answered out of the little hymn book that Eunice gave her for a Christmas present. "Who made my heaven secure, will here all good provide. While Christ is rich, can I be poor? What can I want beside?" "Is that all?" said Carl, when he had waited about 2 minutes for more. "That is the story of one of my leaves," said the hymn book. "Well, I want to hear about all the others," said Carl, "so tell me." "Oh, I can't," said the hymn book. "It would take me 6 weeks." "Were you Clary's hymn book?" said Carl. "No, I was the other one, that belonged to little Eunice. But years after that, several of us met in an old auction room. There I learned some of the particulars that I have told you." "What is an auction room?" said Carl. "It is a sort of intelligence office for books," replied the collection. "There I got the situation of companion to a lady, and went on a long sea voyage. I had nothing to do but to comfort her, however." "And did you do it?" said Carl. "Yes, very often," said the hymn book. "Perhaps as much as anything else except her Bible." "Now, my pretty little boat," said Carl the next day, "you shall tell me your story. I will hear you before that ugly old stocking." Carl was lying flat on his back on the floor, holding the boat up at arm's length over his head, looking at it and turning it about. It was a very complete little boat. "I shall teach you not to trust to appearances," said the boat. "What do you mean?" said Carl. "I mean that when you have looked at me, you have got the best of me." "That's very apt to be the way with pretty things," said the stocking. "It isn't," said Carl, for he had more than once known his mother call him a pretty boy. "However that may be," said the boat, "I can't tell a story." "Can't tell a story? Yes, you can," said Carl. "Do it right off." "I haven't any to tell," said the boat. "I was once of some use in the world, but now I'm of none, except to be looked at." "Yes, you are of use," said Carl, "for I like you, and you can tell a story too if you've a mind, as well as the pine cone." "The pine cone has had a better experience," said the boat, "and has kept good society. For me, I have always lived on the outside of things ever since I can remember, and never knew what was going on in the world, any more than I knew what was going on inside of my old tree. All I knew was that I carried up sap for its branches. When it came down again, or what became of it, I never saw." "Where were you then?" said Carl. "On the outside of a great evergreen oak in a forest in Valencia. I was a piece of its bark. I wish I was there now, but the outer bark of those trees gets dead after a while, and then the country people come and cut it off, and sell it out of the land." "And were you dead and sold off?" said Carl. "To be sure I was, as fine a piece of cork as ever grew. I had been growing 9 years since the tree was cut before." "Well, but tell me your story," said Carl. "I tell you," said the little cork boat, "I haven't any story. There was nothing to be seen in the forest but the great shades of the kingly oaks, and the birds that revelled in the solitudes of their thick branches, and the martins and such like. It was fine there, though. The north winds, which the pine cone says so shake the heads of the fir trees in his country, never trouble anything in mine. The snow never lay on the glossy leaves of my parent oak, but no Norska lived there, or if there did, I never knew her. Nobody came near us, unless a stray peasant now and then passed through, and when I was cut down, I was packed up and shipped off to England, and shifted from hand to hand, till John Krinken took it into his head years ago to make a sort of cork jacket of me with 1 or 2 of my companions, and I have been tumbling about in his possession ever since. He is done for me now. I am prettier than I ever was before, but I shall never be of any use again. I shall try the water, I suppose, again a few times for your pleasure, and then probably I shall try the fire for the same." "The fire? No, indeed," said Carl. "I'm not going to burn you up. I'm going to see you sail this minute, since you won't do anything else. You old stocking, you may wait till I come back. I don't believe you've got much of a story." And Carl sprang up and went forthwith to the beach to find a quiet bit of shallow water in some nook where it would be safe to float his cork boat. But the waves were beating pretty high that day, and the tide coming in, and Altogether there was too much commotion on the beach to suit the little Santa Claus, as he had named her. So Carl discontentedly came back and set up the little boat to dry and turned him to the old stocking. The stocking story. "It's too bad," said Carl. "I've heard 6 stories and a little piece, and now there's nothing left but this old stocking." "I believe I will not tell you my story at all," said the stocking. "But you shall," said Carl, "or else I will cut you all up into little pieces." "Then you will certainly never hear it," said the stocking. "Well now," said Carl, "what a disagreeable old stocking you are. Why don't you begin at once?" "I am tired of being always at the foot," said the stocking, "as one may say, at the fag end. And besides, your way of speaking is not proper. I suppose you have been told as much before. This is not the way little boys used to speak when I was knit." "You are only a stocking," said Carl. "Everything that is worth speaking to at all is worth speaking to politely," replied the stocking. "I can't help it," said Carl. "You might tell me your story then. I'm sure one of my own red stockings would tell its story in a minute." "Yes," said the grey stocking, "and the story would be, 'Lived on little Carl's foot all my life and never saw anything.'" "It wouldn't be true then," said Carl, "for I never wear 'em except on Sundays. Mother says she can't afford it." "Nobody afforded it once," said the stocking. "My ancestors were not heard of until 10 or 1100 years ago, and then they were made of leather or linen. And then people wore cloth hose. And then sometime in the 16th century, silk stockings made their appearance in England. But there was never a pair of knit woolen stockings until the year 1564. "I say," said Carl, "do stop, will you, and just go on with your story." And putting his hand down into the old stocking, he stretched it out as far as he could on his little fingers. "You'd better amuse yourself in some other way," said the stocking. "If my yarn should break, it will be the worse for your story." "Well, why don't you begin then?" said Carl, laying him down again. "It's not always pleasant to recount one's misfortunes," said the stocking, "and I have come down in the world sadly. You would hardly think it, I dare say, but I did once belong to a very good family." "So you do now," said Carl. "There was never anybody in the world better than my mother, and father's very good too." "Yes," said the stocking again, "Mrs. Krinken does seem to be a quite respectable sort of woman for her station in life, very neat about her house, and I presume makes most excellent chowder. But you see, where I used to live, chowder had never even been heard of." "I declare," said the stocking, "I can hardly believe it myself. I think my senses are getting blunted. I have lain in that closet so long with a string of red onions that I have really almost forgotten what musk smells like." But my Lady Darlington always fainted away if anybody mentioned onions, so of course the old squire never had them on the dinner table even. A fine old gentleman he was, not very tall, but as straight almost as ever, and with ruddy cheeks and hair that was not white but silver colour. His hand shook a little sometimes, but his heart never, and his voice was as clear as a whistle. His step went cheerily about the house and grounds, although it was only to the music of his walking stick, and music that was truly to all the poor people of the neighbourhood. His stick was like him. He would neither have gold nor silver head to it, but it was all of good English oak, the top finely carved into a supposed likeness of Edward the Confessor. As for my lady, she was all stateliness, very beautiful too, or had been, and the sound of her dress was like the wings of a wild bird. "I think I shall like to hear this story," said Carl, settling himself on his box and patting his hands together once or twice. "I dare say you will," said the stocking, "when I tell it to you. However, well, a great many years ago it was Christmas Eve at Squire Darlington's, and the squire sat alone in his wide hall. Every window was festooned with ivy leaves and holly, which twisted about the old carving and drooped and hung round the silver sconces, and thence downwards towards the floor. The silver hands of the sconces held tall wax candles, but they were not lit. The picture frames wore wreaths, from which the old portraits looked out gloomily enough, not finding the adornments so becoming as they had done a century or so before, and even the squire's high-backed chair was crowned with a bunch of holly berries. There was no danger of their being in his way, for he rarely leaned back in his chair, but sat up quite straight, with one hand on his knee and the other on the arm of the chair. On that particular evening his hand rested on me, for I and my companion stocking had been put on for the first time. "I don't see how he could get his hand on his stocking," said Carl. if he sat up. Look, I couldn't begin to touch mine. You needn't try to tell me anything about stockings, replied that article of dress somewhat contemptuously. I know their limits as well as most people. But in those days, Master Carl, gentlemen wore what they call small clothes, very different from your newfangled pantaloons. I don't wear pantaloons, said Carl. I wear trousers. But the stocking did not heed the interruption. The small clothes reached only to the knee, a little above or a little below, and so met the long stockings halfway. Some people wore very fanciful stockings of different colours and embroidered, but Squire Darlington's were always of grey woolen yarn, very fine and soft as you see I am, and tied above the knee with black ribbons, and his shoes were always black, with large black bows and silver buckles. He sat there alone in the wide hall with one hand upon me and his eyes fixed upon the fire, waiting for the arrival of the Yule log. For in those days, the night before Yule or Christmas, the chief fire in the house was built with an immense log, which was cut and brought in with great rejoicing and ceremony, and lighted with a brand saved from the log of last year. All the servants in the house had gone out to help roll the log and swell the noise, and the fire of the day had burnt down to a mere bed of coals, and the hall was so still you could almost hear the ivy leaves rustle on the old wall outside. I don't know what the squire did. What did he stay there for? Said Carl. Was he thinking? He might have been, said the stocking. Indeed, I rather think he was, for he stroked and patted me 2 or 3 times. Or he might have been listening to the wind sing its Christmas song. Can the wind sing? Said Carl. Aye, and sigh too, most of all about the time of other people's holidays. It's a wild, sighing kind of a song at best, whistled and sung and sighed together, sometimes round the house, and sometimes through a keyhole. I heard what it said that night well enough. You won't understand it, but this was it. Christmas again, with its holly berries so bright and red, they gleam in the wood, they grow by the lane, oh, hath not Christmas a joyful tread? The wind took much less time to sing the song than I have taken to tell it, said the stocking. A low sigh round the house and a whistle or two told all. Then suddenly a door at the lower end of the hall flew open, and a boy sprang in, exclaiming, "Grandfather, it's coming!" He was dressed just after the fashion of the old squire, only with delicate white stockings and black velvet small clothes, while his long flapped waistcoat was gaily flowered, and his shoes had crimson rosettes. And almost as he spoke, a side door opened, and my lady glided in, her dress rustling softly as she came, while the wind rushed in after her, and tossed and waved the feathers in her tall headdress. Then was heard a distant murmur of shouts and laughter, and young Edric clapped his hands and then stood still to listen, and presently the whole troop of servants poured into the hall from that same door at the lower end. All were dressed in the best and gayest clothes they had. The women wore ivy wreaths, and the men carried sprigs of holly at their buttonholes. First came a number bearing torches, then many others rolling and pulling and pushing the great log, on which one of the men, whimsically dressed, was endeavouring to keep his seat, while every other man, woman and child about the place crowded in after. Then the log was rolled into the great fireplace and duly lighted, and everybody clapped hands and rejoiced in its red glow, and Master Edric shouted as loud as the rest. "Edric," said my lady when the hall was quiet once more, though not empty, for the household were to spend Christmas Eve there together. "Edric, go take a partner and dance us a minuet." And Edric walked round the hall till he came to little May Underwood, the forester's daughter, and then bringing the white stockings and the crimson rosettes close side by side together, and making her a low bow, he took her hand and led her out upon the floor. The Yule log was in a full blaze now, and the clear light shone from end to end of the hall, falling upon the bright floor and the long row of servants and retainers that were ranged around, and glossily reflected from the sharp holly leaves and its bright red berries. The old portraits did not light up much, and looked very near as gloomy as ever, but a full halo of the fireshine was about the squire's chair, and upon my lady as she stood beside him. 2 or 3 of the serving men played a strange old tune upon some strange old instruments, and the forester now and then threw in a few wild notes of his bugle, that sounded through the house and aroused all the echoes, but the wind sighed outside still. And all this while the little dancers were going through the slow, graceful steps of their pretty dance, with the most respectful bows and curtsies, the most ceremonious presenting of hands and acceptance of the same, the most graceful and complicated turns and bends. Edric presented his right hand to little May, and they danced gaily forward to where my lady stood near the squire, and made their low reverence, first to her, then to each other. Then Edric led his little partner back to her seat, and returned to his grandmother, for my lady was his grandmother, and he had no parents. As the Yule log snapped and crackled and blazed higher and higher, even so did the mirth of all in the great hall. They talked and laughed and sang and played games, and not an echo in the house could get leave to be silent. All of a sudden, in the midst of the fun, a little boy dressed like Robin Redbreast in a dark coat and bright red waistcoat opened one of the hall doors, and just showing himself for a moment, he flung the door clear back, and an old man entered. His hair was perfectly white, and so was his beard, which reached down to his waist. On his head was a crown of yew and ivy, and in his hand a long staff topped with holly berries. His dress was a long brown robe which fell down about his feet, and on it were sewed little spots of white cloth to represent snow. He made a low bow to the squire and my lady, and when Robin Redbreast had discreetly closed the door so far but a little wind could come in, he began to sing in a queer, cracked little voice. "Oh, here I come, old Father Christmas, welcome or not. I hope, old Father Christmas, will never be forgot. Make room, room, I say, that I may lead mince pie this way. Walk in mince pie, and act thy part, and show the gentle ladies thy valiant heart." With that, Robin opened the door again, and another figure came in, dressed like a woman in a dark purple gown bordered with light brownish yellow. A large apple was fastened on top of her head, and she wore bunches of raisins at her ears instead of earrings, while her necklace was of large pieces of citron strung together, and her bracelets of cloves and allspice and cinnamon. In her hand she carried a large wooden sword. "What was that for?" said Carl, who had listened with the most intense interest. "Why, to fight off people that wanted to make her up into real mince pie, I suppose," said the stocking. She came into the room saying, "Room, room, you gallant souls, give me room to rhyme. I will show you some festivity this Christmas time. Bring me the man that bids me stand, who says he'll cut me down with an audacious hand. I'll cut him and hew him as small as a fly, and see what he'll do then to make his mince pie. Walk in, St. George. Oh, in come I, St. George, the man of courage bold. With my sword and buckler I have won 3 crowns of gold. I fought the fiery dragon, and brought him to the slaughter. I saved a beauteous queen, and a king of England's daughter. If thy mind is high, my mind is bold. If thy blood is hot, I will make it cold." "What did he want to do that for?" said Carl. "Oh, in the days when St. George lived," replied the stocking, "the more men a man had killed, the more people thought of him. And this man was trying to make himself like St. George. He had a great pasteboard helmet on his head, with a long peacock's feather streaming from the top of it, and a wooden sword, and a tin-covered shield on which were nailed clusters of holly berries in the figure of a cross. His shoes were of wood too, and his jacket and small clothes of buckskin, with sprigs of yew fastened down all the seams, and great knots of red and green ribbons at the knees. As soon as he had sung his song, he began the fight with mince pie, and a dreadful fight it was if one might judge by the noise. Also mince pie's sword became quite red with the holly berries, but St. George let his shield take all the blows, and when mince pie had spent her strength upon it, he thrust at her with his sword, and down she came." "Who, mince pie?" said Carl. "Oh, that's too bad." "Mince pie thought so too," said the stocking, for she cried out, "Oh, St. George, spare my life!" Then said old Father Christmas, "Is no doctor to be found to cure mince pie, who is bleeding on the ground?" "Was there any?" said Carl. "There was somebody who called himself one. He came running right into the hall the minute old Father Christmas called for him, and you never saw such a queer little figure. He had an old black robe and a black cap on his head, and a black patch over one eye." "What was that for?" said Carl. "He had been curing himself, I suppose," said the stocking, "and it would seem that he wasn't satisfied with any of his features, for he had put on a long pasteboard nose painted red, and a pointed pasteboard chin. In his hand he carried a great basket of bottles. If one might believe his own account, he was a doctor worth having. Oh yes, there is a doctor to be found, to cure mince pie who is bleeding on the ground. I cure the sick of every pain, and none of them are ever sick again. Father Christmas thought it must cost a good deal to be cured after that fashion. So like a prudent man, he said, "Doctor, what is thy fee?" And the doctor probably didn't like to be questioned, for he answered, £10 is my fee, but 15 I must take of thee, before I set this gallant free. But as it was necessary that mince pie should be cured, Father Christmas only said, "Work thy will, doctor." Then the doctor took a bottle out of his basket and began to dance and sing round mince pie. I have a little bottle by my side, the fame of which spreads far and wide. Drop a drop on this poor man's nose. And with that, mince pie jumped up as well as ever. But that wasn't all, said Carl. What else? That was not quite all, said the stocking, for another man came in with a great basket of dolls at his back and a tall red cap on his head. And he said, "Oh, in I come, I, little saucy Jack, with all my family at my back. Christmas comes but once a year, and when it does, it brings good cheer. Roast beef, plum pudding, and mince pie. Who likes that any better than I? Christmas makes us dance and sing. Money in the purse is a very fine thing. Ladies and gentlemen, give us what you please." Then Squire Darlington and my lady each took out some money, and Edric carried it to the maskers. And as he hadn't any money himself, he told them that he was very much obliged to them. Then they went off. "What did they give them the money for?" said Carl. "Oh, they expected it. That was what they came for. People used to go about in that way to the rich houses at Christmas time to get a little money by amusing the gentlefolks." "I suppose they were very much amused," said little Carl with a sigh. "Very much, especially Edric. And after they were gone, he came and stood before the great fire and thought it all over, smiling to himself with pleasure. "Edric," said my lady, "it is time for you to go to bed." "Yes, grandmother, but I'm afraid I can't go to sleep." "Why not?" said Squire Darlington. "What are you smiling at?" "Oh, we've had such a splendid time, grandfather. The people were dressed so finely, and didn't mince pie fight well, and wasn't the doctor queer? And I'm sure my stocking will be as full as anything." Squire Darlington drew the boy towards him and seated him on his knee while he spoke thus, and passing his hand caressingly over the young joyous head, and smoothing down the brown hair that was parted, child fashion, over the middle of the forehead, and came curling down upon the lace frill, he looked into Edric's face with a world of pleasure and sympathy. "And so you've enjoyed the evening, dear boy," he said. "Oh yes, grandfather, so much. I'm sure Christmas is the very happiest time of the whole year." Squire Darlington stroked down the hair again and looked in the bright eyes, but with something of wistfulness now, and without stirring his hand from the boy's head, his look went towards the fire. The Yule log was blazing there steadily, although it now showed a great front of glowing coals that yet had not fallen from their place. A clear red heat was all that part of the log, and hardly to be distinguished from the bed of coals below, while bright points of flame curled and danced and ran scampering up the chimney, as if they were playing Christmas games. But each end of the log yet held out against the fire, and had not even lost its native brown. The squire looked there with an earnest gaze that was not daunted by the glowing light, but his brows were slightly raised, and though the caressing movement of his hand was repeated, it seemed now to keep time to sorrowful music, and his lips had met on that boundary line between smiles and tears. Presently a little hand was laid against his cheek, and a little lace ruffle brushed lightly over its furrows. "Grandfather, what's the matter? What makes you look grave?" The squire looked at him, and taking the hand in his own, patted it softly against his face. "The matter, my dear," he said, "why, the matter is that Christmas has come and gone a great many times." "But that's good, grandfather," said Edric, clapping his hands together. "Just think, there'll be another Christmas in a year, only a year, and we had one only a year ago, and such a nice time." "Only a year," repeated the old man slowly. "No, Edric, it is only 60 years. "What do you mean, grandfather?" said the boy softly. 60 years ago, my dear," said Squire Darlington, "there was just such a Yule log as that burning in this very fireplace, and the windows and picture frames, there were not quite so many then, were trimmed with holly berries and yew from the same trees from which these wreaths have come today, and this old chair stood here, and everything in this old hall looks just as it does now." "Well, grandfather," said Edric, catching his breath a little, and the wind gave one of its lone sighs through the keyhole. "Well, my dear, instead of one dear little couple on the floor," and the old man drew the boy closer to him, "there were 6 as merry-eyed and light-footed little beings as ever trod this green earth. At the head I stood with your grandmother, Edric, a dear little thing she was," said Squire Darlington with a kindly look towards my lady, whose eyes were cast down now for a wonder, and her lips trembling a little. "Her 2 brothers and my 2, and the orphan boy that we loved like a brother, his sister, and my 4 little sisters, precious children that they were, made up the rest. Light feet and soft voices and sweet laughter. They went through this old hall like a troop of fairies, I was going to say, more like a ray of pure human happiness. My father sat here and my mother opposite. Her picture watches the very spot now, and of these good friends at the other end of the hall. Aye, old Cuthbert remembers it. There were 2 or 3, but many others that bore their names. My child, that is 60 years ago." "And where are they now, grandfather?" said Edric under his breath. "In heaven, the most of them," said the old man solemnly. "But one couple remains of the 6. Of those other dear children not one is left, and not one but gave good hope in his death that he was going to be with Jesus. They remember yet that he came to earth, but they sing another song from ours. Their hearts swell with a different joy. We shall know one day, if we are faithful. They are exceeding fair to my remembrance. They are fairer now in reality." The old squire was silent for a few minutes, with his eyes turned again towards the fire, while Edric looked up at the sweet portrait to which his grandfather had referred, and wondered how it was that those eyes always met his. Then Squire Darlington spoke again, and with a different manner. "Everybody that has money makes Christmas a time of feasting and rejoicing, Edric," he said. "What does Christmas Day celebrate?" "The birth of Christ," said Edric gravely. "Yes," said Squire Darlington, "the birth of Christ, who though he was rich, yet for our sakes became poor, that we through his poverty might be made rich. There is a motto for Christmas Day, aye, for one's whole life." "Grandfather," said Edric, "does everybody that loves Christ love all the poor, disagreeable people?" "That is what the Bible says, Edric. For if any man seeth that his brother have need, and shutteth up his bowels of compassion from him, how dwelleth the love of Christ in him?" "Grandfather," said Edric thoughtfully, "when I am a man I will take a great deal of care of poor people." It was a rather sad smile that the old man gave him, and yet it was very tender. "My dear Edric," he said, "never say, 'When I am a man I will do good.' There is hardly any kind of good work that a child may not help forward, or help to keep back. Will you wait till you are a man, Edric, before you begin to love Christ?" "I think I do love him now, grandfather," said Edric. "I should think everyone would. He has done so much for us." There was the same look of love and sadness for a moment in the old man's face before he answered. "My motto has another bearing, dear boy, and one which should be the first in the heart of every man and every child in this world, which Christ died to save. 'If ye love me, keep my commandments.'" And when the Christmas Eve was almost ended, Squire Darlington kissed and blessed his little grandson, and Edric went upstairs to bed, and the wind sighed no more that night. "And did he do as he said he would when he got to be a man?" inquired Carl. "I don't know," said the stocking. "I never heard."